Blacker Library presents Warhammer 40,000 There Are No Women on Krieg. Written by James Krieger. Preformed by Felix Weil. In the shadowed recesses of the Black Library, where even the Eldar fear to tread, there lies a forgotten archive of forbidden knowledge. Here, in the twisting corridors beyond memory's reach, ancient tomes whisper secrets that predate the fall, their pages bound in substances that defy comprehension. The very air thrums with psychic resonance, where demon-touched scrolls lie scattered among the remains of scholars who delved too deep into truths not meant for mortal minds. In this forsaken corner of infinite knowledge, there is only peril. The shelves groan under the weight of blasphemous texts, each word a potential gateway to madness. Spectral guardians patrol between the stacks, their forms shifting between nightmare and shadow, eternally bound to protect secrets that could unravel reality itself. The dust of centuries coats everything, and in that dust lie the powdered bones of the ambitious and the foolish alike. Yet for those with courage born of desperation or wisdom tempered by necessity, untold treasures await. Here lie the true names of demons, the formulae for weapons that could cleave souls from bodies, and prophecies that could reshape the fate of entire worlds. But know this, seeker of forbidden lore, in this forgotten vault of the Black Library, knowledge is both salvation and damnation, and the price of wisdom is measured not in coin, but in the very essence of one's soul. Enter, if you dare. But remember, some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Chapter 1. The iron grating beneath Lyra's knees bit through her worn coveralls, each ridge pressing metal teeth into bone. Shackles, standard-issue Departamento Munitorum restraints, she noted with the detached precision of someone whose mind refused to process the moment. Chafed raw welts around her wrists. The links clinked with each tremor that ran through her body, a sound that echoed off the marble columns of the arbitration chamber like distant autogun fire. An elderly woman in the gallery leaned forward, her voice cutting through the chamber's oppressive silence like a laser gun through smoke. "Don't worry, sweetie," she whispered, her weathered face creased with genuine compassion. "You seem like a nice person. The Emperor protects." Her rheumy eyes held the kind of faith that had survived decades of industrial servitude, the sort of unshakable belief that kept the Imperium's machinery grinding forward. Arbitrator Vex's helm snapped toward the interruption, the red eye lenses flaring. "Gallery disturbance. Section 9 Alpha." His voice crackled through the Vox grill like burning parchment. "Immediate termination for disruption of Imperial justice proceedings." The crack of the Arbite's shock maul echoed once. The old woman's body crumpled between the pews, her final breath escaping as a whispered prayer that no one would remember come morning. Arbitrator Vex loomed behind the obsidian bench, his carapace armor scarred from decades of urban pacification. A servo skull hovered at his shoulder, its picked recorder lens whirring as it focused on her face. The crimson seal of the Adeptus Arbites glowed on his breastplate, fresh paint over scratched ceramite that had seen better wars. "Lyra Casella, Hab Block 496, Subsector 31. His Vox grill turned each word into a mechanical rasp. "Failure to remit tithe assessment penalty. Accumulated interest, 49 throne gelt, 16 centimes." 49 gelt. The amount that would feed her family for 2 months. The amount she'd scraped together 3 times over, only to have the Munitorum offices closed for Imperial holiday each time she'd arrived to pay. The penalty for tax delinquency is well established. Vex's gauntleted fingers drummed against the bench, a rhythmic percussion that reminded her of her father's old laser gun cooling down after drill practice. Life sentence of hard labor, immediate transfer to penal servitude. The words hit like a frag grenade in an enclosed space. Hard labor. Every Imperial citizen knew what that meant, disappearing into the Imperium's industrial machine, their lives measured in productivity quotas rather than years. Where convicts lasted until the toxic atmosphere, industrial accidents, or sheer exhaustion claimed them in the Emperor's name. Lyra's vision tunneled. The chamber's incense couldn't mask the stench of recycled air, machine oil, and something else, fear sweat from the dozen other condemned citizens chained along the wall behind her. Their breathing created a rasping chorus, punctuated by muffled sobs and the occasional rattle of restraints. "Please." The words scraped past her lips before she could stop it. "I have the money now. I can pay." "Sentence has been rendered." Vex's voice carried the finality of a bolter round chambering. "Transport to departure facility commences at 0600 hours. Emperor protects." The servo-skull's pict recorder clicked off with mechanical satisfaction. Behind her, someone whispered the litany of acceptance. The words blurred together as an arbitrator proctor stepped forward, shock maul crackling with barely contained energy. His uniform bore the creases of a man who'd processed thousands of souls through this same chamber, each fold pressed sharp enough to cut. "On your feet, convict." Time to learn what service to the Emperor truly means. The shackles pulled tight as Lyra rose, already learning the first lesson every servant of the Emperor understood. Compliance was survival, and survival was measured in heartbeats. The march from judgment to imprisonment blurred into a nightmare of echoing corridors and flickering lumens. Arbeitz's shock maul never touched her, but its electric hum provided constant reminder of what happened to those who stumbled or fell behind. The other condemned shuffled alongside her. 12 souls bound for the same fate, their faces already carrying the hollow stare of the walking dead. The lift descended for what felt like hours, carrying them deeper into the hive's bowels, where even the recycled air tasted of despair. Emergency lighting strips cast everything in hellish red, turning familiar human features into grotesque masks. Someone ahead of her, a man whose work-calloused hands marked him as another hab-block labourer, mumbled prayers to the Emperor in a voice cracked by fear. When the doors ground open with a rusty shriek, the detention block's entrance yawned before them like a wound in the hive's flesh. An Adeptus Arbeits guard waited beyond the threshold, his lasgun casually slung but finger-resting near the trigger guard. Combat veteran, she realized. The way he positioned himself to cover the corridor spoke of someone who'd learned caution through blood and fire. "Welcome to your new home," the guard announced with the bored efficiency of a man reciting scripture. "You have 48 hours to make peace with the Emperor. Use them wisely." The arbitrator facility's detention block stretched beneath the surface like a concrete cancer, its corridors lit by flickering lumens that cast everything in shifting shadows. Lyra's cell, designation 9 Alpha, measured 3 meters by 2, barely enough space for the rusted cot and waste reclamation unit that constituted her new world. The first night, she'd counted the scratches gouged into the cell's walls. Hundreds of them, carved by fingernails and contraband metal, each one a small rebellion against the machine that ground through human lives with bureaucratic efficiency. Some formed words: "Emperor, forgive me," "Tell Mara I loved her," "Treason." Others were simple tallies, marking days or prayers or heartbeats until the end. A guard corporal made his rounds every 4 hours, his boots striking the ferrocrete in measured cadence. Former Cadian, from the way he carried himself, spine straight, eyes constantly scanning for threats that would never come in this tomb of administrative justice. His lasgun hung loose at his side, powered down, but ready. The weapon's housing bore the scars of real combat, pitted marks where shrapnel had kissed the barrel shroud. "Casella, Lyra," he called through the cell door that morning. "Processing in 1 hour. Present yourself for medical examination and final sentencing confirmation." Medical examination. The words carried weight beyond their clinical meaning. Everyone knew what they checked for: physical compatibility with servitor implants, neural pathway integrity, the basic anatomical requirements for lobotomization and cybernetic integration. The unlucky ones, those whose bodies couldn't handle the augmentation, had their organs harvested or were simply shot. A mercy, some said. The processing chamber smelled of counterseptic and machine oil. Tech adept Vaughan presided over the examination table, his mechandendrites clicking against the metal surface as he calibrated scanning equipment. Half his face had been replaced with brass and steel, the augmetic eye whirring as it focused on each prisoner in turn. "Strip, arms spread. Do not move unless instructed." The scanner's beam played across her body like a cold caress, mapping bone density, organ placement, nervous system integrity. Behind Vaughan, a servo skull recorded everything, its pict caster capturing angles and measurements that would determine her final value to the Imperium. The scanner's secondary array hummed to life as Vaughan's mechandendrites danced across control surfaces slick with condensation. The examination table's restraints bit into her wrists, standard Imperial pattern, designed for compliance rather than comfort. Above her, a cluster of Auspex units descended on articulated arms, their sensors glowing with pale green light. "Reproductive assessment commencing," Vaughan announced to the servo skull hovering at his shoulder. "Imperial Decree 7749-Alpha requires genetic viability screening for all female subjects designated for penal servitude." The words hit her like a shock maul to the stomach. She'd heard whispers in the detention block, fragments of conversation cut short when guards approached. They check everything. Every damn thing. But hearing it spoken aloud in Vaughan's clinical monotone made it real in a way that twisted her gut. Ovarian function. Within normal parameters, hormonal indicators, suitable for conception. Genetic markers, ... The mechandendrite paused, stylus scratching against data slate. "Clean bloodline. No detectable mutation or hereditary defects." Behind the tech adept, an Arbeit sergeant reviewed the readouts with practiced indifference. His flak armor showed the usual wear of extended duty, and a shock maul hung from his belt alongside standard riot gear. The man had processed this same procedure countless times before, just another body in the Emperor's vast machinery of justice. "Fertility rating?" the sergeant asked, not bothering to look up from his data slate. "Optimal. Subject exhibits prime reproductive capability with high probability of successful gestation." Vaughan's augmetic eye whirred as it focused on the readings. "Estimated viable offspring potential. 8 to 10 birthing cycles over optimal breeding span." The clinical language couldn't disguise what they were really discussing. Not her life, not her choices, her value as breeding stock for the Imperium's endless hunger for bodies. The realization crawled up her throat like acid. "Standard notation for potential requisition," the sergeant ordered. "If the subject survives initial deployment, flag for possible reassignment to breeding protocol facilities." If she survived. The words carried no weight in his voice, just another variable in the vast equation of Imperial logistics. Lyra's fingers clenched against the restraint table's cold metal, the only rebellion her body could manage. "Cranial capacity, adequate. Spinal column, straight. Motor function, within acceptable parameters." Vaughan's Vox Grill turned his assessment into mechanical pronouncements. "Suitable for basic to hard labor." Basic labor. The words should have been a relief. No weapon servitors, no combat augmentation, just hauling supplies and operating machinery until her body gave out. But relief felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. Vaughan's mechandendrites retracted with mechanical precision. "Assessment complete. Subject classified as labor slave, grade 3, with notation for genetic resource potential. Transport authorization confirmed." The servo skull's pict caster clicked off, its recording complete. Another body processed, another number added to the endless tallies that fed the Imperium's war machine. The sergeant tucked his data slate into his uniform jacket and moved toward the door, already forgetting her face. "Clean her up and prep for transport," he called over his shoulder. "The penitent's burden doesn't wait for anyone." As the restraints released, Lyra's hands moved instinctively to her stomach, a gesture that felt both protective and pointless. Whatever future they'd catalogued for her body, it belonged to the Imperium now. She was just along for the ride. The final hours passed in a blur of grey uniforms, identification tattoos burned into her left shoulder, and the constant sound of boots in corridors. Other prisoners moved through the facility like ghosts, their faces carrying the hollow look of those who'd already begun dying inside. At 5:30 hours, the cell door opened with a pneumatic hiss. "Transport leaves in 30 minutes, the overhead vox announced. "Follow the yellow line to the loading zone." The shackles felt heavier this time, each step toward the loading dock a countdown to something that couldn't be undone. Through the facility's reinforced windows, she caught glimpses of the landing pad where surface transports waited, their cargo ramps yawning open like hungry mouths. Behind her, the detention block's doors sealed shut with mechanical finality. Ahead lay the transport, the void, and whatever passed for mercy on a world where death was the only currency that mattered. The march to the surface took 43 minutes through service corridors that reeked of industrial lubricants and human desperation. An Arbeits corporal followed behind their column, his lasgun trained on the prisoners as they navigated the maze of maintenance tunnels and cargo lifts that honeycombed the hive's superstructure. "Follow the yellow line," his voice crackled through the voxcaster at regular intervals. "Any deviation results in immediate pacification." 24 condemned souls shuffled in restraints ahead of him, their identification bands catching the overhead lumens like badges of shame. The lifts were the worst part, ancient freight elevators that groaned under the weight of human cargo, their safety mechanisms bypassed decades ago to increase capacity. "Follow the yellow line," the corporal repeated as they disembarked each level, his tone as mechanical as the servitors that maintained the facility. Each ascent felt like a journey through the hive's digestive system, rising from the detention block's depths through layers of administrative offices, processing centers, and finally to the launch pad's industrial sprawl. The yellow guidance stripe painted on the floor had been worn thin by countless feet, but it remained visible enough to trace their path toward whatever transport awaited them. When the final doors opened, the morning air hit them like a physical blow, recycled atmosphere thick with promethium fumes and the acrid bite of thruster wash. Above them, the hive's upper reaches stretched toward a sky the color of old blood, while below lay the vast expanse of the launch pad itself. The launch pad sprawled across the hive's crown like an infected wound, its ferrocrete surface scarred by decades of orbital traffic. Emergency lumens cast everything in hellish amber, while the constant thrum of atmospheric processors failed to mask the stench of promethium fumes and human fear. Across the vast expanse, a dozen surface transports squatted on their landing struts like feeding insects, each one gorging on streams of human cargo. Guard Lieutenant Corvin supervised the loading with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd shipped thousands of souls to their deaths. His uniform bore the insignia of the Departamento Munitorum, each ribbon and commendation earned through decades of processing human cargo. A las pistol rode high on his hip, its grip worn smooth by constant handling. Around him, similar scenes played out at every transport. Officers barking orders, guards herding prisoners, the endless machinery of imperial justice grinding forward with remorseless precision. Thousands of condemned souls shuffled across the launch pad in grey columns, all bound for the same fate of hard labour in the Emperor's industrial complexes. The prisoners wore identical grey identification bands, their crimes reduced to numerical codes stamped on metal tags that clinked with each step. Each stream of human misery flowed toward the designated transports with bureaucratic efficiency that would have impressed a tech adept. No sorting required when every destination promised the same grinding servitude. "Form up in fives," Corvin barked through his vox grill, the words echoing across the launch pad where similar commands rang out from a dozen other loading supervisors. "No talking, no dawdling. Anyone who can't walk gets shot. Step over the bodies and keep moving." The condemned shuffled into ragged formations, their shackles clinking in a discordant symphony that mixed with the transport's idling engines. Somewhere behind Lyra, a woman sobbed, quiet, desperate sounds that cut through the industrial noise like a blade. The sound lasted 30 seconds before a Arbeits corporal silenced it with a shock maul prod to the kidneys. The cargo ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss, revealing the transport's belly, a hollow metal cavern stripped of anything resembling comfort. Guards barked orders as they herded the prisoners up the ramp, shoving shackled bodies into the cramped space with rifle butts and shock mauls. No seats, no handholds, just corrugated metal flooring and bulkheads that wept condensation. They packed the condemned shoulder to shoulder, back to chest, until the air itself seemed to compress under the weight of human desperation. The clinking of chains created a constant metallic whisper as prisoners tried to find space that didn't exist. The smell of unwashed bodies, fierce sweat, and recycled air created a miasma that burned the throat. When the last prisoner squeezed inside, there wasn't room to fall down. The press of bodies and restraints held everyone upright in a swaying mass of flesh, metal, and despair. Servo skulls moved among the prisoners like mechanical vultures, their augmetic limbs whirring as they verified identification tattoos. One paused before Lyra, its optical array focusing on the fresh brand burned into her shoulder. The servo skull's vox unit crackled with static before emitting a mechanical bleat of confirmation. "Casella, Lyra, labor designation. Compliance acceptable." The words held no emotion, no recognition of her humanity. To the cybernetic brain, she was cargo, valuable only for her ability to haul ammunition and operate basic machinery until her body gave out. The realization should have stung, but numbness had settled over her like a shroud. Steam vented from the transport's hull as its atmospheric systems cycled, preparing for the journey through the void. The sound reminded her of the industrial presses in her former workplace, massive machines that shaped metal with inexorable force. Now she was the metal, being shaped for the Imperium's needs. The cargo bay doors ground shut with mechanical finality, sealing out the last glimpse of the hive's poison sky. Emergency lumens bathed the packed prisoners in sickly red light as the transport's engines roared to life, vibrations traveling through the hull and into their bones. No guards remained inside, just hundreds of condemned souls pressed together in the dark, their chains creating a symphony of despair as the ship lifted off. The journey to orbit took 40 minutes of bone-jarring acceleration that threw the mass of bodies against bulkheads with each course correction. Someone near the back screamed as the transport banked hard, their voice lost in the chorus of groans and sobs that filled the compartment. The air grew thick with fear sweat and worse, bodily functions that couldn't be controlled in the crushing press of humanity. Vomit splattered against the walls as the ship's gravity fluctuated, and there was nowhere to move away from the spreading pools of filth. When the penitent's burden's tractor beams seized the transport, Lyra felt the strange sensation of artificial gravity taking hold, a queasy weightlessness that her body had never experienced before. If there had been viewports to see through, she might have caught glimpses of the massive ship's hull plating sliding past, kilometers of scarred ceramite and rust stains that spoke of decades in the void. The vessel's true nature would have become apparent as they drew closer, a repurposed Imperial Guard troop transport, its weapon hardpoints still active and bristling with defensive turrets. What had once carried soldiers to war zones now bore the utilitarian modifications of civilian penal service. But the cargo bay remained sealed, offering no view of the scorch marks and patched hull breaches that told the story of its military past, or the fresh administratum seals and departamento munitorum markings that proclaimed its current purpose. The transport was being drawn into one of the vessel's cavernous hangar bays, swallowed by the ship like a morsel of food. The bay itself showed signs of conversion from military to penal transport use. Mounting brackets where drop pods had once been secured, blast shields repurposed as cargo restraints, and atmospheric barriers that had been expanded to accommodate bulk prisoner operations rather than rapid troop deployment. The transport settled into its docking cradle with a series of metallic clanks that rang through the hull like funeral bells. Pressure seals hissed as the airlocks mated, and suddenly they were breathing ship's air, recycled atmosphere, thick with the taste of promethium fumes and human misery. The transport doors ground open with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and the survivors stumbled out into the hangar bay's harsh lumens. Several bodies remained motionless in the transport's belly, crushed, suffocated, or simply expired during the journey. A waiting detail of orange-clad prisoners moved forward alongside mechanical servitors, their cleaning equipment already prepared for the grim task of clearing the dead and hosing down the compartment. "On your feet!" Valen ordered. "Welcome aboard the penitent's burden. Try not to disgrace yourselves. You're cargo now. Follow the red lines to prisoner hold 46 Gamma. Any deviation results in immediate pacification." The hangar bay stretched like a converted cathedral of steel, its ceiling lost in shadows cast by harsh lumen strips. Dozens of other surface transports sat in neat rows across the deck plating. Their loading ramps extended like the tongues of feeding beasts. Guard corporals from the Departamento Munitorum supervised the unloading of each transport, their movements coordinated with the precision of a military operation. Red guidance lines, painted on the deck, led away from each transport toward different sections of the ship, creating a web of colored paths that sorted human cargo with bureaucratic efficiency. Hundreds of prisoners from other transports were already forming ragged lines across the hangar's deck plating, their grey identification bands marking them as convicts bound for hard labor. The sound of their shuffling feet and clinking restraints created a rhythm like distant artillery, punctuated by barked orders from Munitorum guards directing each group toward their designated colored lines. Guard Sergeant Kleizar stood near the hangar's far bulkhead, where a massive iris hatch led deeper into the ship's interior. His shotgun was cradled with practiced ease, the weapon's barrel showing wear marks where his thumb habitually rested, a veteran's tell that spoke of countless deployments. His pale eyes swept the crowd with mechanical precision, cataloguing faces that would soon be reduced to slave designation numbers. "Move along, scum! The Emperor's justice waits for no one." As the mass of prisoners shuffled toward the ship's interior, panic began to spread through the crowd like poison in water. The reality of their situation, the void ship, the guards with their casual brutality, finally broke through the numbness that had carried them this far. A man near the loading ramp suddenly broke from the formation, his restraints jangling as he stumbled toward what he must have thought was an escape route among the docking bay's support pillars. He'd made it perhaps 10 meters before Kleizer's first shot took him center mass. The solid slug round punched through his sternum and dropped him face first onto the deck plating, blood spreading in a widening pool that caught the overhead lumens like spilled oil. The crack of the shotgun echoed through the bay like thunder. Then chaos erupted. 3 more prisoners bolted in different directions, their terror overriding any rational thought. One, a young woman with the pale complexion of an underhive dweller, made it halfway to a maintenance hatch before a guard corporal cut her down with a burst from his laser-gun. The last bolts punched smoking holes through her back, and she collapsed in a heap of grey fabric and spreading crimson. Another runner, an older man whose work-stained coveralls marked him as a manufacturum labourer, tried to hide behind a stack of supply crates. A female guardsman stalked him down with methodical precision, her shock maul crackling as she cornered him. The first blow dropped him to his knees. The second stopped his screaming. The third runner, barely more than a boy, his crime ticker reading "failure to report for labor draft," had frozen in terror halfway between the formation and the bay's far wall. He stood there, shaking, tears streaming down his face, as Guard Sergeant approached with his riot gun raised. "Please," the boy whispered, "I just want to go home." The sergeant's expression never changed. The shotgun blast echoed off the bay's metal walls. "Anyone else feeling ambitious?" Kleiser's voice carried the bored professionalism of a man who'd made this speech 1,000 times. He cracked his shotgun's breech, ejecting the spent shells with metallic clicks that rang through the sudden silence. Fresh rounds slid home with mechanical precision. Lyra caught sight of the woman beside her, elderly, maybe 60 standard years, her hands shaking as she stared at the spreading pools of blood across the deck plating. A data slate crime ticker still hung around her neck. "Failure to register birth records, subsector 12. 23 years of bureaucratic oversight, and now this." "Sweet throne," the old woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of bodies being dragged away by servitors. "What have we become?" Behind Kleiser, the two guardsmen emerged from the crowd, one wiping blood from her shock maul, the other ejecting a spent power cell from his lasgun. Their carapace armor bore the scuff marks of recent enforcement actions, each scratch marking another prisoner who'd learned compliance the hard way. "Let me make this simple," Kleiser continued, chambering another round. "You run, you die. You resist, you die. You cause problems for my ship, my crew, or my schedule, you die. The only difference between you and that poor bastard is timing." The old woman beside Lyra had gone corpse pale, her lips moving in silent prayer. Around them, the crowd pressed forward with renewed desperation, each person suddenly eager to reach whatever fate awaited them rather than face Kleiser's shotgun. "That's more like it." Kleiser's scarred face split into something that might have been a smile. "Welcome aboard the Penitent's Burden. Next stop, Krieg. Try not to die before we get there. The Munitorum hates paperwork." The march from hangar to cargo hold stretched through corridors that had once carried Navy personnel to battle stations, now repurposed for herding human cargo to their doom. Blast doors marked with faded tactical designations opened onto passages lined with jury-rigged life support conduits and hastily installed prisoner processing equipment. A guard sergeant led the procession, his boots ringing against deck plating that still bore the scorch marks of ancient battles. Behind him, 300 condemned souls shuffled through corridors barely wide enough for half their number, the press of bodies creating a claustrophobic nightmare of unwashed flesh and industrial disinfectant. The cargo hold's entrance yawned before them like the mouth of some mechanical beast, its threshold marked by scanning arrays that catalogued each prisoner as they passed. Servitors flanked the doorway, their augmetic limbs clicking as they verified identification tattoos and recorded entry data with mechanical precision. The hold itself had been a weapons storage bay in the ship's former life, its bulkheads still bearing the mounting brackets and blast scarring from its military service. Now restraint harnesses hung from the walls in neat rows, hundreds of them, each one a promise of the journey ahead. The air tasted of promethium fumes and recycled oxygen, thick enough to coat the back of her throat. As Lyra was shoved toward an empty restraint, she caught one last glimpse of the hangar through the closing iris hatch, the detention facility already a memory, taking with it the last connection to the woman she'd been 48 hours ago. Now there was only the void ahead, and whatever waited on the other side of it. The engines roared to life, and the Penitent's Burden began its journey through the void. Servitors moved through the prisoner holds with mechanical efficiency, their augmetic limbs checking restraints and tightening any slack in the binding systems. One paused before Lyra, its optical sensors scanning her shackles before giving each chain a sharp tug. The machine's Vox grill crackled with static as it confirmed her secure status, then moved on to the next prisoner. Throughout the hold, similar inspections continued. No prisoner would enter the warp unrestrained. The ship's transition from dock to void began with a bone-deep vibration that ran through every rivet and weld joint in the massive hull. Lyra felt it first in her teeth, then spreading through her skeleton as the vessel's primary drives awakened from their slumber. The restraint harness bit deeper into her shoulders as acceleration pressed her back against the metal framework, the straps designed more for preventing movement than comfort. Around her, the other prisoners reacted to their first taste of void travel with predictable horror. The man to her left, a thin, nervous individual whose crime ticker read unlicensed food distribution, had gone grey-green as the ship's artificial gravity generators struggled to compensate for the changing vectors. His breathing came in short, panicked gasps that fogged the recycled air with condensation. "Emperor, preserve me," Corvin whispered, the words barely audible over the engine noise. I can't feel the ground anymore." The woman across from Lyra, elderly and frail, had begun praying in the old tongue, words her grandmother might have taught her in the deep Cribanian hab-blocks where the ancient ways still held sway. Her voice rose and fell in a rhythm that spoke of desperate faith. Hands clutched around a makeshift aquila carved from scrap metal that the guards had somehow missed. The cargo hold's atmospheric processors labored against the increasing load of human fear and biological waste. Ventilation fans whirred at maximum capacity, but they couldn't keep pace with 300 terrified souls packed into a space meant for half that number. The air grew thick and stale, carrying the metallic taste of recycled oxygen and the underlying stench of human misery. The hold offered no viewports, just bare metal bulkheads that gave no indication of their departure from the world below. Whatever final glimpse of the planet's surface might have been visible was denied to the prisoners, leaving them with only the sensation of increasing acceleration and the vibrations that told of their journey into the void. Somewhere beyond the hull, orbital defense platforms would be tracking their departure with automated precision, but the condemned saw nothing of the world they were leaving behind. A violent shudder ran through the ship's frame as the Geller field generators came online, their alien hum adding another layer to the cacophony of machinery and human suffering. The field's activation sent ripples of disorientation through the cargo hold, a sensation like being turned inside out while falling through cold water. Several prisoners vomited simultaneously, the sound echoing through the metal chamber like a chorus of the damned. A guard corporal made his way through the hold with practiced indifference, his boots clanking against the deck plating as he checked restraints and verified that no one had died during the initial acceleration. His laser gun hung across his chest, power cell glowing with ready charge, while his free hand carried a data slate that tracked the human cargo like inventory. "Shut up and breathe through your noses," he announced to no one in particular. "We've got 3 weeks of this ahead of us, and I don't want to spend it listening to your whining." 3 weeks. The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. 3 weeks trapped in this metal coffin, breathing recycled air and watching her fellow prisoners slowly lose their minds. 3 weeks to contemplate what waited for them on Krieg, if they survived the journey at all. The ship's intercom crackled to life with a burst of static, followed by a voice that carried the authority of absolute command. Captain Commander Thorne, from the sound of it, a man whose tone suggested decades of ferrying human cargo through the void's endless darkness. "Attention, prisoners," the voice announced with barely concealed disdain. "You are now aboard the rogue trader vessel Penitent's Burden, operating under contract to the Departamento Munitorum. Your wretched existence defiles these decks for 21 standard days, during which time you will remain in your assigned holds like the animals you are. Food and water will be provided at regulation intervals, more than such scum deserves. Any attempt to sully ship operations with your presence will result in immediate execution. The Emperor protects the righteous." The intercom clicked off, leaving behind only the sound of engines and human breathing. 21 days of this. 21 days of gradual dehumanization, watching people break down one by one until only the shells remained. By the time they reached Krieg, they'd already be halfway to becoming servitors. Lyra closed her eyes and tried to find some corner of her mind that the fear hadn't touched yet, somewhere she could retreat to when the walls of the cargo hold closed in completely. But even behind her eyelids, she could feel the weight of the void pressing against the ship's hull, an endless darkness that cared nothing for human hopes or dreams. The first few hours were the worst. The ship's artificial gravity fluctuated as they cleared the planet's gravitational well, sending waves of nausea through prisoners who'd never experienced anything beyond solid ground beneath their feet. Bodies swayed in their restraints like hanged men, the metal frameworks creaking under the shifting weight as acceleration forces played havoc with inner ears that had never known anything but planetary gravity. Lyra's harness cut into her shoulders. The worn synthetic leather cracked from countless previous occupants. To her left, a husk of a man, sentenced for black market food distribution, hung limp in his restraints, his face grey-green with motion sickness. Spittle drooled from his slack jaw, mixing with the tears that hadn't stopped since they'd sealed the cargo hold. "Never thought I'd miss the smell of recaf processing," he mumbled through cracked lips. Back home, that smell meant morning shift, meant credits, meant. He trailed off, focusing on not adding to the mess coating the deck plates. An old woman, maybe early 30s, Goethe, she'd whispered introductions when the guards weren't around, had begun talking to herself in the third hour. A steady stream of conversation with people who weren't there, her voice barely audible over the engine throb. "Yes, Marcus, I'll have dinner ready." The children are playing in the courtyard. Can you hear them laughing? By the 6th hour, the restraints released with a pneumatic hiss as the ship reached stable acceleration toward the warp translation point. Prisoners slumped forward, many too weak to stand after hours of being held upright by the metal frameworks. The first death since being restrained occurred as an elderly man collapsed to the deck plating, his heart finally giving out from the strain of the journey. A young man near the port bulkhead simply stopped breathing. Whether from panic, a weak heart, or the crushing despair that seemed to seep through the bulkheads like poisonous fog, nobody could say. He slumped forward in death, and it wasn't until a guard made his rounds hours later that anyone in authority noticed. The man barked orders for servitors to drag the corpse away, cursing about the paperwork that came with each casualty during transport. The food came in the form of nutrient paste dispensed from wall-mounted feeders every 12 hours. Grey-brown sludge that tasted of recycled protein and despair, barely enough to keep a person functional. The water was worse. Recycled ship's supply that carried the metallic tang of failing filtration systems and the bitter aftertaste of chemical purification. Within the first day, the hierarchies began to form. Varric emerged as the de facto leader of the starboard section, a scarred veteran of the planetary defense forces who'd been sentenced for desertion during a Tyrannid incursion. His left arm hung useless from an old bioweapon wound, but his voice carried the authority of someone who'd ordered men to their deaths and lived to tell about it. The younger prisoners gravitated toward him like metal filings to a magnet, desperate for any semblance of order in the chaos. "Listen up, maggots," he'd growled during the second day, his voice cutting through the constant background noise of weeping and retching. "Guards come through here twice a day, food distribution and waste collection. Anyone who causes problems gets reported. Anyone who gets reported gets shot. We keep our heads down, we keep quiet, and maybe some of us live to see Krieg." The port side organized differently. Maxus the Bloat, so named for the corpulent mass that spilled over his restraint harness, had been a mid-level enforcer for the port authority before his sentencing for accepting bribes. He understood leverage, and more importantly, he understood fear. Within 3 days, he'd established a protection racket centered around the food dispensers. "Everyone eats," he wheezed through layers of fat and scar tissue, "but some eat better than others. You want your full ration? You want to make sure nobody accidentally spills your water? Then you contribute to the community fund. The community fund consisted of anything valuable enough to trade: wedding rings pried from fingers, dental work hammered out with improvised tools, even fingernails pulled off to serve as crude cutting implements. Those who couldn't pay found their food rations mysteriously reduced, their water supplies contaminated with spit and worse. By the end of the first week, 2 more had died, victims of dehydration and malnutrition. The guards removed them with the rest during the daily corpse detail, their bodies dragged away by servitors to be processed through the ship's reclamation systems with bureaucratic efficiency. Lyra had managed to avoid both factions by keeping her head down and her mouth shut. She minded her own business, tried to remain unremarkable, and spoke only when directly addressed. It was a strategy that had served her well in the factory districts: blend into the background, become another face in the crowd, survive by being forgettable. The strategy nearly failed when a scarred woman with gang tattoos cornered her near the waste reclamation units. The gangers' intentions became clear when calloused hands grabbed at Lyra's coveralls, but the assault lasted only seconds before shock mauls cracked against skull and ribs. The guards made an example of the would-be rapist, dragging her broken body through the hold as a reminder that damaged goods meant reduced quotas and unwanted paperwork. She'd chosen invisibility, and violence had reinforced its value. By the second week, the ship had become a floating tomb of human degradation. The original 300 prisoners had been winnowed down through death, madness, and the casual brutality of the overcrowded hold. Bodies hung in their restraints for days before removal, bloating and stinking in the recycled air, until even the guards couldn't ignore the smell. The lack of proper sanitation had turned the cargo hold into a breeding ground for disease and despair. Waste collection occurred once daily, performed by prisoners selected at random and restrained afterward. The deck plating bore permanent stains from blood, vomit, and worse, while the air recycling systems wheezed under loads they were never designed to handle. Skin infections had become commonplace, spreading through the packed bodies like wildfire. Lyra's wrists and shoulders bore the deep, weeping sores that marked prolonged restraint abuse, while others showed signs of scurvy, malnutrition, and the 1,000 small degradations that came from treating human beings like cargo. Hair fell out in clumps, teeth loosened from vitamin deficiency, and the constant stress had aged everyone by years in the span of days. The psychological toll was worse than the physical. Prisoners had begun to lose track of time, of identity, of the basic human connections that separated them from animals. Some talked to imaginary companions, others had retreated into catatonic silence, and a few had developed the hollow, empty stare that preceded complete mental collapse. The ship's recycling systems had begun to fail by the second week. The air grew thick and stale, tasting of machine oil and human waste. Condensation dripped from the overhead pipes, creating a constant percussion that mixed with the engine noise to form a maddening rhythm that burrowed into your brain and stayed there. Then came the announcement that would change everything. The ship's intercom had been silent for days after the initial departure, leaving only the sound of engines and labored breathing to mark the passage of time. When the static finally cleared, the voice that emerged carried an otherworldly quality that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the brainstem. Guard Sergeant Kleisar's voice crackled through the ship's Vox system, distorted by something more than interference. The words themselves seemed to writhe in the recycled air, taking on weight and substance that ordinary speech should never possess. "Attention, prisoners. We are preparing for translation to the warp. Return to your restraints immediately and secure yourselves for translation. Do not look directly at the observation ports. Any prisoner found outside their designated position will be executed immediately." Teams of guards entered the hold alongside mechanical servitors, moving through the rows of prisoners with practiced efficiency. The servitors checked each restraint with mechanical precision, their augmetic limbs tugging at chains and testing harness connections. Guards followed behind, shock mauls ready, ensuring compliance as the machines confirmed each prisoner was properly secured for the horrors of warp travel. The warp. Even those who'd never left their birth world knew that name. The realm of nightmares and impossible horrors, where ships travelled faster than light by sailing through humanity's collective unconscious. Where demons waited in the spaces between thoughts, and madness was just another form of navigation. The first sign came as a tremor in the deck plates, not the steady vibration of the engines, but something else. Something that seemed to come from outside the ship, as if space itself was shuddering. The lumen strips began to flicker, casting the cargo hold in strobing shadows that played tricks on exhausted minds. The translation itself hit like a sledgehammer to reality's foundation. For one infinite moment, the cargo hold existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Lyra could see through the bulkheads to corridors that stretched in impossible directions, witness the ship's hull rippling like liquid metal, feel her own body stretched across light years of non-space while compressed into a single point of screaming consciousness. The sensation lasted forever, and no time at all. When reality reasserted itself with the violence of slamming steel doors, half the prisoners were already screaming. Then the real screaming started. It began with Goethe, the old woman who'd been talking to ghosts since the journey began. Her voice rose to a shriek that seemed to bypass the ears and drill directly into the brain. "They're coming through the walls! Can't you see them? The children aren't playing anymore. They're... Her words dissolved into incoherent babbling as she thrashed against her restraints, the synthetic leather cutting into her wrists until blood ran down her arms like crimson tears. Around her, other prisoners began to react, some laughing hysterically, others weeping, a few staring at the bulkheads with expressions of absolute terror. Lyra felt it too. A pressure behind her eyes, like someone was trying to push needles through her skull from the inside. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe, as if the oxygen was being replaced by something else. Something that tasted of copper and ozone and the bitter residue of burned dreams. Cardoek was the first to fully break. The man who'd distributed black market food to feed hungry families began tearing at his own flesh with his fingernails, gouging deep furrows in his cheeks and forehead. "Get them out!" he screamed. "Get them out of my skin! They're laying eggs under my skin!" Blood poured down his face as he clawed deeper, his fingernails breaking off in the wounds. Other prisoners tried to look away, but the warp had its hooks in them now. Reality had become negotiable, and the rules of physical law were merely suggestions. A man, 3 harnesses down from Lyra, began to speak in a voice that wasn't his own, a liquid bubbling sound that formed words in a language that predated human speech. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, visible and poisonous. Where they touched other prisoners, skin began to blister and burn. Maxus the Bloat had begun to sing. Not words, just a low humming that seemed to resonate with the ship's hull, making the metal vibrate in harmonics that hurt to hear. His massive form swayed in the restraint harness, and with each movement his flesh rippled in ways that flesh shouldn't ripple, as if things were moving underneath his skin, things with too many legs and not enough purpose. "Emperor, preserve us," Varric whispered, his veteran's discipline cracking like eggshell. "Emperor, preserve us all." But the Emperor felt very far away in the writhing madness of the warp, and the demons pressing against the ship's Geller field were very, very close. Time became meaningless. Seconds stretched into hours, or perhaps hours compressed into heartbeats. The cargo hold existed in a bubble of barely contained reality, surrounded by an ocean of pure nightmare. And with each passing moment, that bubble grew thinner. The dead began to move. Not resurrection. That would have been merciful. The corpses in their restraints began to twitch and spasm, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams, their eyes tracking movement that wasn't there. One by one, they turned their heads toward the living prisoners, and their expressions were hungry. Lyra closed her eyes and tried to remember her father's voice, the way he'd sung lullabies during the air raid sirens, the smell of his old uniform, and the weight of his service medals. Anything to anchor her mind to reality before the warp tore it apart and fed the pieces to things that shouldn't exist. Outside the ship, impossible colors painted the void, and demons pressed their faces against the hull, whispering promises in languages made of mathematics and madness. The dead thrashed in their restraints, synthetic leather and metal buckles holding them fast, even as their bodies moved with unnatural purpose. Their fingers clawed at the air, grasping for flesh just beyond reach, while their mouths opened and closed in silent screams that somehow carried more weight than sound. Then came the boots in the corridor, not the measured cadence of routine patrol, but the urgent rhythm of soldiers responding to crisis. The cargo hold's main hatch cycled open with a pneumatic hiss, and Guard Sergeant Kleizar entered flanked by 4 guardsmen in full riot gear. Their carapace armor bore fresh scorch marks, evidence of other problems throughout the ship. Kleizar's shotgun hung ready at his side, while his men carried laser guns set to maximum charge. "Warp contamination confirmed," Kleizar announced, his voice flat and professional despite the horror surrounding them. "Authorized purge protocols in effect." "Row-by-row inspection," Kleizar barked, his voice cutting through the moans and whispers of the still-living prisoners. "Check for signs of warp taint. Anything suspicious gets purged." The guardsmen spread out in a systematic pattern, moving down each row of restraint harnesses with mechanical precision. Their laser guns swept left and right, targeting beams painting red dots across faces twisted by terror and exhaustion. "Row 8, clear!" called out a guardsman, his weapon tracking across prisoners who pressed themselves back in their harnesses, trying to become invisible. "Row 9. A different guardsman paused at a woman 3 positions down from Lyra. The prisoner was perhaps 40 standard years, her face marked by hard living, a crooked nose broken in childhood, asymmetrical features that spoke of poor nutrition and harder circumstances. She'd been sentenced for food hoarding, nothing more. "This one's wrong. Thrown ugly," the guardsman announced, his targeting beam steady on her forehead. Look at that face. Mutations, maybe. Could be witch-touched. The woman's eyes went wide with terror. "Please, I'm not. I was born this way. My mother, she worked in the chem plants, the radiation—" "Witch," Kleizar confirmed without even looking. "Purge it." The last beam punched through her skull in a flash of superheated light. Her head snapped back against the restraint harness, smoke rising from the perfectly round hole between her eyes. The smell of cooked brain tissue mixed with the already foul air. Row 10, continuing sweep. They moved with bureaucratic efficiency, checking each prisoner for signs of warp contamination, real or imagined. A man whose hands had been burned in an industrial accident. Possible mutation, purge. A teenager whose eyes were different colors. Genetic abnormality, witch sign, purge. An elderly woman who'd been muttering prayers. Unsanctioned religious behavior, potential heresy, purge. The last beams lit up the cargo hold like strobing death. Each execution was clinical, professional, accompanied by the scratch of stylus on data slate as Kleizar recorded the disposals for his reports. When they reached the genuinely dead, the reanimated corpses that had triggered the purge, their approach was different, more careful. Each body received multiple las rounds to ensure complete destruction of potentially tainted flesh. The sweep itself was brutal and careless. Las rounds meant for the possessed went wide, cutting down untainted prisoners who'd simply been too slow to get clear. Shock mauls crushed skulls indiscriminately as guards worked through their fear with violence, killing anything that moved wrong or looked suspicious. The stench of burned flesh mixed with ozone from overcharged power cells as the purge continued without regard for collateral damage. "Contamination sweep complete," Kleisar announced after 43 minutes of systematic murder. Estimated loss, 62% of cargo, within acceptable parameters for warp exposure incident. Lyra realized she was still breathing, somehow overlooked in the sweep. Relief flooded through her as she understood she had survived whatever madness had claimed so many others. "Sir," a guardsman called out, consulting his data slate. "Protocol requires cleanup detail for contaminated materials. Do we requisition volunteers?" Kleisar looked around the carnage-strewn hold, his expression calculating. "How many bodies?" 188 confirmed dead, sir, plus the pieces. The sergeant's jaw worked as he considered the logistics. 5 should be sufficient. We've already screened for exposure. Anyone still breathing is clean enough. He paused, studying the surviving prisoners. "Make the call." The guardsman nodded and raised his voice to address the hold. "Clean-up detail volunteers. 5 prisoners required for corpse removal and sanitation duties. Volunteers will have restraints removed for work detail while all others remain secured until decontamination is complete. Raise your hands now." Lyra started to raise her hand, better to volunteer than be selected randomly, but a calloused grip clamped down on her wrist before she could lift it fully. "Don't," whispered the man beside her. She pulled her hand back, looking at him properly for the first time. His weathered face bore the deep lines of someone who'd spent decades in Imperial service, and his eyes held the hard wisdom of a survivor. "Tobias Crane," he said quietly, "and you don't volunteer for anything on a ship like this." 5 hands rose from the crowd, all from the kind of hard-faced underhivers who'd learned that volunteering sometimes meant survival. A woman with ritual scars covering her arms and the lean build of a sumprat. 2 men whose gang tattoos had been burned away by Arbeitsbrands, leaving only scar tissue and memories. A 4th prisoner whose augmetic eye and missing fingers spoke of tunnel work in the deep hives. The last volunteer bore the pallor of someone who'd spent too long breathing recycled air in the Undercity's depths. The guards unlocked their restraints with practiced efficiency, and the volunteers immediately began the grim work. They grabbed corpses by arms and legs, dragging the dead across blood-slick deck plating toward the hold's exit. Bodies left wet trails behind them, some from blood, others from worse things. The volunteers worked without conversation, their faces set in the blank expressions of people who'd seen too much death to be bothered by a little more. The selected prisoners were herded toward the exit under heavy guard, the guards' weapons trained on them as they hauled their gruesome cargo. Their faces showed the hollow resignation of people who understood they were walking toward death but had no choice in the matter. Lyra watched them go, flanked by guardsmen with weapons ready. The condemned moved with the shuffling gait of the already dead, their grey uniforms disappearing into the ship's corridors. The volunteers worked methodically, dragging corpses and body parts from the hold in a steady procession of death. Blood trails marked their passage across the deck plating as they hauled load after load toward the ship's disposal systems. The work continued for hours. Grab, drag, dump, return. The stench of death gradually gave way to the sharp bite of industrial disinfectant as servitors began sanitizing the areas they'd cleared. 6 hours later, the volunteers finished dragging the last of the gore and bodies from the hold. They disappeared through the exit with their final load, hauling the remnants toward whatever furnace or disposal chute awaited. The guards followed, sealing the hold behind them. The remaining prisoners waited in their restraints, listening to the distant sounds of the ship's operations. Hours passed. The volunteers never returned. The cargo hold fell silent, except for the wheeze of failing air recyclers and the distant throb of engines. The smell of lasfire and cooked flesh lingered in the recycled atmosphere, mixing with the existing stench of human misery to create something that transcended mere disgust and entered the realm of existential horror. In the sudden quiet that followed the executions, the sound of warp energies pressing against the ship's hull became audible, a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carrying with it the whispered promises of things that should not exist. "Attention cargo, hold 46 Gamma," Kleizar's voice crackled through the internal Vox system. "Purge complete. Restraint release authorized for remaining prisoners." The sound of restraint mechanisms disengaging echoed through the hold like a mechanical symphony, dozens of clicks and hisses as magnetic locks released and synthetic leather straps retracted into their housing units. For the first time in days, Lyra felt her feet touch solid deck plating. Her legs nearly buckled. The artificial gravity, the constant pressure of the restraints, and the systematic dehydration had left her muscles weak and unsteady. Around her, other prisoners were experiencing the same struggle, some collapsing entirely, others leaning against the bulkheads for support. "Sweet throne," whispered someone behind her. "I forgot what standing felt like." Tobias Crane moved with more confidence than most, his void-born physiology adapting quickly to the change. He offered Lyra a steadying hand as she tested her balance, and for the first time since the journey began, she noticed him properly. A thin, weathered man whose eyes held the particular exhaustion that came from too many years in the void. His uniform bore the same prison markings as everyone else, but something about the way he carried himself suggested experience beyond his apparent crimes. "Careful. Ship like this probably has a dozen cargo holds minimum, maybe more. Crew won't waste time on prisoners who can't walk when we reach Krieg." The implication was clear. Weakness meant death, even here. Tobias Crane opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression that held no surprise, only the weary acknowledgement of someone who'd witnessed this pattern countless times. "They execute them in the furnace room," he said quietly. "Potential warp contamination vectors. Saves having to transport the bodies afterward. Efficient." His voice carried the bitter tone of a man who'd learned that efficiency was just another word for cruelty when wielded by the Imperium. As prisoners slowly spread throughout the hold, the true scope of their losses became visible. Where once 300 bodies had filled the restraint harnesses, now perhaps 193 remained. The systematic purge had claimed more than just the obviously dead and the cleanup crews. "Cargo hold 46 Gamma reporting," Kleizar spoke into his Voxcaster. "Post-purge count, 193 viable units remaining. Ready for transition to standard transport protocols." Through the internal speakers, similar reports filtered in from other parts of the ship. "Cargo hold 2, 168 viable units. Cargo hold 12, 204 viable units. Cargo hold 1579 viable units." The numbers painted a grim picture. Thousands of prisoners aboard the penitent's burden, all bound for the same destination, all experiencing the same systematic reduction in numbers. The ship wasn't just a transport. It was a mobile processing facility, winnowing the weak from the merely expendable. "How many holds?" Lyra asked quietly. Crane listened to the reports with the practiced ear of someone who understood ship classifications. Retired troop transport, converted for administratum use. This was probably a light cruiser hull originally, maybe even an old Navy escort that changed hands. 20 cargo holds minimum, maybe 24 if they've stripped out the weapon decks. Call it 6, maybe 6,500 prisoners when we left port. The math was simple and horrible. If every hold had suffered similar losses. "They're not expecting all of us to make it to Krieg, are they?" she said. Crane's weathered face showed no surprise at the realization. Krieg doesn't need 6,000 slaves all at once, but they need a constant supply. A ship like this probably makes the run every few months, delivers whatever's left alive, and goes back for more. Around them, prisoners were discovering the freedom to move within their confined space. Some approached the water dispensers and food terminals, desperate to supplement their meager rations. Others simply sat on the deck plating, overwhelmed by the luxury of being able to change position. Near the port bulkhead, a small group had gathered around one of the few remaining possessions, a prayer book that had somehow survived the searches and confiscations. They whispered the litany of acceptance in voices hoarse from screaming and dehydration. As Lyra tested her unsteady legs, she found herself walking beside Crane toward the water dispensers. The luxury of choosing her own movement, even within the confines of the cargo hold, felt almost overwhelming. "Crane," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that the guards wouldn't overhear. "What is Krieg? I mean, really. I've heard the name, but—" She trailed off, realizing how little she actually knew about her destination. Crane glanced around, ensuring they were far enough from the prayer group and other clusters of prisoners. When he spoke, his voice carried the cadence of someone recounting a legend that happened to be true. "Krieg used to be a garden world," he began, pressing the activation rune on the water dispenser. The thin stream of recycled liquid that emerged tasted of metal and chemical purification. 500 years ago. Maybe more. Green fields, blue skies, the kind of place you'd want to raise children. Then came the rebellion. His eyes focused on something far beyond the cargo hold's bulkheads, as if he could see through the ship's hull to the destination that awaited them. Colonel Jerton, of the 83rd Imperial Guard Regiment, decided he didn't like taking orders from Terra anymore. Had enough support to turn most of the planet against the Imperium. Civil war lasted maybe 6 months before the Loyalists realized they couldn't win conventionally. Lyra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's recycled air. She cupped her hands under the dispenser, savoring the precious drops of water. "What happened?" "Atomic fire," Crane said simply. "The Loyalists cracked every nuclear stockpile on the planet, turned the whole world into a radioactive wasteland, killed maybe 90% of everything living. Rebels, Loyalists, civilians, didn't matter. But it stopped the rebellion." The words hung in the stale air like a curse. A few other prisoners had drifted closer, drawn by the quiet horror of the story. "That was 5 centuries ago," someone whispered. "Surely it's recovered by now." Crane's laugh held no humor. "Recovery?" The radiation never went away. The nuclear winter lasted decades. What's left is a world of trenches and bunkers, acid rain and poisoned soil. The death cores of Krieg, they're the only thing that grows there now. "Death cores?" Lyra asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Best shock troops in the Imperial Guard, some say. Born in the radiation, raised in the trenches. They don't feel fear the way normal humans do, can't afford to. When the Imperium needs someone to charge into certain death, they call the death cores. Crane paused, his voice dropping even lower. "And here's the thing about Krieg. There are no women there. Not anymore." The statement hit their small group like a physical blow. Lyra felt her stomach clench as the implications became clear. "They're all clones," Crane continued. "That's what the Navy scuttlebutt says anyway. Vat-grown from genetic templates of the original Loyalists. Perfect soldiers, born already knowing how to die for the Emperor. They don't need women because they don't reproduce conventionally." "But then why—" Lyra's voice caught in her throat. "Why are they taking us there? Female prisoners specifically." Crane's expression was grim. "Because even clone production needs genetic diversity eventually. Fresh genetic material, and servitors." He gestured at the cargo hold around them. "Servitors need biological components, organs, neural tissue, parts that wear out." The truth settled over their small group like a shroud. The reproductive assessments during processing, the fertility ratings, the careful cataloguing of genetic viability. They weren't being sent to Krieg to work in the traditional sense. They were being sent as raw materials. "The Kriegers don't see us as people," Crane said quietly. "To them, we're just another kind of supply shipment. Biological resources to be processed and allocated as needed. Some of us will become servitors. Others will be used for genetic harvesting. The lucky ones might just be worked to death in the manufactorums. Lyra stared at her hands, remembering the clinical voice of tech adept Vaughan cataloguing her reproductive capacity. 8 to 10 birthing cycles over optimal breeding span. Not a future, a quota. "How do you know all this?" she whispered. 23 years in the void, Crane replied. "You hear things. Ship's crews talk. Navy intelligence briefs filter down. And I've made this run before." "Before?" "Different ship, different crime. Managed to escape during a pirate attack in the Cadian system. Took me 3 years to work my way back to civilized space." His voice carried a bitter edge. "Didn't matter. Administrative error in the records. They assumed I was dead, closed my case, and when I showed up again..." He shrugged. "Desertion and identity fraud. Back on the next transport." Crane's eyes swept the hold, taking in the remaining prisoners with the calculating gaze of someone assessing resources. "If any of us are going to survive this, we'll have to escape," he said quietly. "Krieg means certain death. Not the quick kind they promise, but slow dissolution in radiation and chemical fog. They don't send prisoners there to work. They send them there to die." The penitent's burden shuddered slightly as it continued its passage through the warp, carrying its cargo of human misery toward a world where even hope had been atomized centuries ago. Outside, impossible colors continued to paint the void, but on Krieg, she realized, the Emperor's mercy came in the form of radiation and clone vats, and preservation meant something very different than what any of them had imagined. Chapter 2, 847.M40, Adeptus Mechanicus Research Facility. Designation Helix Prime. Tech Dominus Vex Kitherus mechadendrite scraped against the observation chamber's brass railing, the sound like fingernails on slate in the sterile silence. Below, in the reinforced containment cell, Subject 847. Alpha shambled in an endless circuit around the perimeter walls, 3 steps forward, pause, turn left, repeat. The same pattern it had followed for 16 hours since decantation. "Cortical activity remains minimal," reported Tech Adept Zorin, her Vox grill crackling with static interference from the nearby machinery. "Neural pathways show basic motor function, but higher brain activity is virtually absent." Vex Kitherer's augmetic eye whirred as it focused on the subject below. The clone possessed the physical perfection they had engineered: enhanced musculature, reinforced bone density, optimized organs. But the eyes were empty windows into a hollow skull. No recognition, no awareness, just the mechanical repetition of programmed movement patterns. "Soul light readings?" he queried, though he already knew the answer. "Null across all spectrums," Zorin confirmed, her mechadendrites dancing across the monitoring equipment. "The subject exhibits no psychic resonance whatsoever. According to our measurements, it might as well be an advanced servitor." Which was exactly the problem. The project had begun with such promise. Krieg's recent rebellion, crushed through atomic fire, and the fanatical devotion of its loyalist survivors, had left the world a radioactive wasteland populated by the most dedicated soldiers in the galaxy. The Death Corps emerged from their irradiated trenches already possessed of an unshakable faith in the Emperor and an eagerness for death that made them ideal shock troops. But their recruitment methods were unsustainable. Natural reproduction on Krieg produced children at a rate far below Imperial Guard requirements, and the constant attrition of warfare meant the Corps consumed soldiers faster than they could replace them. Mars had been tasked with finding a solution: rapid clone production to supplement the world's natural population. The biological aspects had been trivial. Forge World Lucius had provided genetic templates harvested from the finest Krieg specimens, while Mars contributed the vat growth technologies refined through millennia of servitor production. Within months, They had achieved perfect physical replication of Death Corps soldiers, complete with the genetic modifications that allowed survival in Krieg's hostile environment. The problem was theological. "Recall Subject 847 Alpha," Vex Kithera commanded. Zorin manipulated the cell's control systems, and the clone stopped its circuit, turning toward the monitoring station with mechanical precision. Its face, identical to that of Colonel Jerton himself, the loyalist hero who had died defending the Emperor's truth, stared up at them with vacant interest. "Subject 847 Alpha, identify yourself," Vex Kithera spoke through the chamber's voxcaster. The clone's mouth opened and closed several times before sounds emerged. "Subject 847 Alpha." The words came in the flat monotone of a cogitator reading data. "State your purpose. Pose unknown. Await instructions." Vex Kithera's flesh hand clenched into a fist. After 3 years of experimentation, hundreds of subjects, and the collective genius of Mars's finest genitors, this was their result. Breathing corpses that possessed all the biological capabilities of a Death Corps trooper, but none of the spiritual fire that made them effective. "The problem," he stated to his assembled research team, "lies not in our methodology, but in our understanding of Imperial doctrine." The other tech adepts gathered around the observation chamber turned their augmetic sensors toward him. Magos Biologis Harax, his lower body replaced entirely by a spider-like assembly of mechanical legs, skittered closer. "Elaborate, Dominus." "The Emperor protects through the gift of the soul," Vex Kithera began, reciting the catechism he had learned as a young acolyte. "Each human spirit is a fragment of his divine essence, bestowed through the sacred act of conception and birth. Our clones possess flesh and blood, neural pathways and genetic codes, but they lack the fundamental spark that makes them human." Tech Adept Uriel raised one of her servo arms in question. "But servitors lack souls as well, and they function adequately for their designated purposes." "Servitors are lobotomized criminals," Vex Kithera corrected. "They once possessed souls, which were severed through surgical intervention and replaced with machine logic. Our clones never possessed souls to begin with. They are biological machines wearing human form." The theological implications were staggering. If souls could not be artificially created or transplanted, then clone production would never achieve the spiritual dedication that made the Death Corps effective. Worse, mass production of soulless human forms might constitute heresy against the Emperor's design. Magos Harax's mechanical legs clicked against the chamber floor as he processed this information. If conventional cloning proves theologically unsound, what alternatives exist? Vex Kithera had been considering this question for weeks. "We require a method that preserves the soul's natural incorporation during the growth process, accelerated gestation rather than artificial creation." "Artificial wombs," Zorin said immediately. "Living subjects to serve as biological incubators for accelerated development." "Precisely." Vex Kithera's augmetic eye whirred as it refocused on the monitoring data. "If the soul is bestowed during natural conception, then we must replicate the conditions of natural pregnancy while accelerating the timeline through chemical and technological intervention. The shift in methodology would require significant resources. Where simple cloning required only genetic material and nutrient solutions, artificial wombs would demand living subjects, women capable of bearing children at an accelerated rate. The process would be demanding, potentially fatal, but it offered the only path to maintaining the spiritual integrity of their subjects. "How many subjects would be required?" asked Harax. Vex Kithera consulted his calculations. "To meet Krieg's recruitment quotas, we would need approximately 10,000 viable wombs in continuous rotation. Each subject could theoretically support 4 to 6 accelerated pregnancies annually before biological breakdown becomes inevitable." The numbers were stark, but achievable. The Imperium possessed no shortage of female criminals, heretics, and other expendable populations. The Departamento Monitorum already maintained extensive transportation networks for prisoner allocation. Redirecting a portion of that human cargo to Mars would require minimal administrative adjustment. "And the theological concerns?" Uriel inquired. "Minimal," Vex Kithera replied. "We would be facilitating natural conception and gestation, merely under controlled conditions and accelerated timelines. The Emperor's blessing would flow through the process as intended, ensuring each child possesses a complete soul." Below in the containment cell, Subject 847 Alpha had resumed its mindless circuit. 3 steps forward, pause, turn left, repeat. A perfect soldier's body housing nothing but programmed responses and biological function. The ultimate failure of their purely technological approach. "Initiate Project Terminus," Vex Kithera commanded. "All current clone production ceases immediately. Begin requisition procedures for female subjects suitable for artificial womb protocols. Priority classification, Hereticus Maximus." As his research team dispersed to implement the new directives, Vex Kithera remained at the observation chamber. Subject 847. Alpha continued its endless march, unaware that it represented the end of one failed experiment and the beginning of something far more ambitious. The artificial womb project would succeed where cloning had failed, but it would require resources on a scale that even Mars had rarely attempted. Thousands of women reduced to biological incubators, their lives measured in pregnancy cycles rather than years. It was a cold calculus, but one that served the greater glory of the Emperor. On Krieg, the Death Corps would continue their endless war against the galaxy's enemies, sustained by an unending stream of artificially gestated soldiers who possessed both the physical perfection of their design and the spiritual fire that made them human. The Emperor protects, Vex Kithera reflected, but sometimes his protection required the most terrible sacrifices. In the depths of Mars, the first requisition orders for Project Terminus began their journey through the Administratum's vast bureaucracy, setting in motion a supply chain of human misery that would feed Krieg's appetite for soldiers for centuries to come. Subject 847-Alpha shambled on, unaware that its existence had doomed 10,000 women to a fate worse than any death the galaxy could offer. Chapter 3. The cargo hold had taken on the rhythm of a dying animal. Slow, labored breathing punctuated by the occasional groan of overstressed metal. In the days following the Purge, the survivors had begun to sort themselves into new hierarchies, new alliances born from shared trauma and the desperate mathematics of survival. Lyra found herself gravitating toward Tobias Crane's corner of the hold, drawn by his steady presence and the way he seemed to understand the ship's moods better than anyone else. While other prisoners huddled in fearful clusters or paced the limited space like caged animals, Crane maintained a calm that felt almost unnatural in their circumstances. "You move like Navy," she observed on the 3rd day after the Purge, watching him navigate the crowded hold with unconscious efficiency. His steps followed the subtle rhythm of the deck plating's expansion joints, and he never seemed to lose his balance despite the ship's constant micro-adjustments. Crane paused in his circuit of the hold, considering her with those pale eyes that had seen too much void. 23 years, he said finally. Started as a rating on the escort frigate Steadfast Virtue, worked my way up to pilot certification before. He gestured at his prison greys. "What kind of pilot?" The question escaped before she could stop it, curiosity overriding the caution that had kept her alive this long. "System boats, mostly. Shuttles, cutters, the occasional cargo hauler. Nothing glamorous." His weathered hands sketched the dimensions of a control layout in the air. But once you learn to read the void, it doesn't matter what hull you're strapped to, ships all speak the same language. Over the following days, their conversations became a lifeline in the metal tomb of the cargo hold. Crane spoke of worlds she'd never imagined. Void stations carved from asteroids where artificial gravity was a luxury, agri-worlds where the horizons stretched beyond comprehension, forge worlds where the sky burned with industrial flame. His voice carried the cadence of someone who'd watched 1,000 sunrises from 100 different systems. "Cadia was the last posting before they caught me," he said during one of their quiet talks, his voice dropping to avoid the attention of guards or other prisoners. "Fortress world. Every man, woman and child born knowing which end of a laser gun to hold. Even the children could field strip a chimera blindfolded." "What was it like?" Lyra asked, genuinely curious. Her world had been limited to hab blocks and factory districts. The idea of an entire planet dedicated to war seemed like something from the propaganda vids. "Like living inside a laser gun barrel. Everything designed for maximum efficiency and killing things that wanted to kill you." Crane's expression grew distant. "Beautiful, in its own way. Purpose without doubt, function without waste. The kind of place that makes sense when everything else has gone insane." He described the massive fortress monasteries that dotted Cadia's surface, their walls built to withstand orbital bombardment, training grounds where regiments practiced the same maneuvers their fathers and grandfathers had perfected. The way the planet's twin moons cast double shadows across parade grounds filled with soldiers who knew they were born to die. "The Cadians had a saying," Crane continued. "The planet broke before the guard did. Turned out to be prophetic in the end." His stories became an escape from the grinding reality of their situation. While other prisoners succumbed to despair or madness, Lyra found herself looking forward to their conversations, fragments of a wider galaxy that existed beyond the ship's hull, proof that there were places where the Imperium's machinery served purposes beyond mere survival. "You know what I miss most?" Crane said one evening as they shared their meager water rations. "The smell of void, clean air. Real recycled atmosphere from a proper ship, not this toxic sludge they're feeding us. There's a crispness to it, like breathing lightning." Lyra tried to imagine it, but her lungs had never known anything but the chemical fog of hive cities and the stale desperation of their current prison. Still, the way Crane described it made her think of mornings in the upper hab levels, those rare times when the atmospheric processors cleared enough smog to let actual starlight through. "What about family?" she asked. 23 years in the void. That's a lifetime." Crane's expression shifted, showing the first crack in his composed facade. "Navy doesn't encourage attachments. Hard to maintain relationships when you're spending months at a time between the stars." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "There was someone once. Astropath on a cruiser out of Baka Sector, but void witches." He shook his head. "They burn bright and die young. Part of the job." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence, broken only by the constant background noise of engines and recycled air. Around them, other prisoners had settled into their own routines. Prayer circles, whispered conversations, the endless pacing of those who couldn't bear to sit still. On the 8th day since the Purge, Lyra finally asked the question that had been building in her mind like pressure in a failing pipe. "You said you escaped before." "When the pirates attacked." She kept her voice carefully neutral, not wanting to sound like she was probing for weakness or advantage. "How?" Crane was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old decisions and their consequences. Redemption's Edge was a bulk hauler, bigger than this ship, but older, weaker. We were 3 days out from Vervenhive when the raiders hit us. His fingers traced patterns on the deck plating, mapping out positions from memory. 2 system boats, fast and mean. Probably Chaos renegades, though they didn't waste time on identification. He described the attack with clinical precision. The way the raiders had crippled the hauler's engines first, then methodically carved through the hull to reach the valuable cargo. The guards had put up token resistance before retreating to the bridge, sealing blast doors behind them and leaving the prisoners to their fate. "Raider boarding parties don't take prisoners unless they're planning to sell them," Crane continued. "These ones weren't in the slave trade. They wanted the ship's cargo manifest and whatever valuables they could strip from the hull. Everything else was to be spaced." "But you got away." "The raiders breached the cargo hold with shaped charges. Crude but effective. Blew a hole straight through to the void, and half the prisoners got sucked out before emergency bulkheads could seal." Crane's voice remained steady, but his eyes showed the memory's weight. "I was wearing a guard's flak vest. Picked it up during the confusion after a raider shot him. Had enough environmental protection to survive maybe 10 minutes in vacuum." Lyra felt her chest tighten at the thought. The void was the final terror that haunted every void-born nightmare, the absolute cold and silence that waited beyond the hull's protection. "I made it to the raider ship's airlock before my recycler gave out," Crane said. "Convinced them I was worth more alive than dead. Spent 2 years working as ship's crew before I could arrange passage back to Imperial space." "And they just let you work for them?" Crane's smile held no warmth. "Pirates need skilled crew as much as anyone else. More sometimes, since they can't exactly post recruitment notices. I kept my mouth shut, did my job, and waited for an opportunity." The story painted a picture of survival through adaptation, the kind of moral flexibility that the Imperium officially condemned but secretly required of anyone who lived long enough to matter. Lyra found herself wondering what compromises she might have to make before this journey ended. "Could it work again?" she asked quietly. "Another escape, I mean." Crane studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing her commitment against the risks of hope. Different ship, different circumstances. The penitent's burden is a converted military vessel. Better security, trained crew, proper containment systems. And we're not just passengers this time. We're cargo with a specific destination. "But it's possible? Anything's possible. Question is whether the cost is worth paying." Crane glanced around the hold, taking in the other prisoners with their hollow stares and broken spirits. "Escape attempt fails on a ship like this. They don't just execute you. They make examples. And examples on penal transports tend to be creative." Despite the warning, Lyra felt something stir in her chest that she'd thought had died in the arbitrator's chamber. Hope, fragile and dangerous, but undeniably real. The idea that their fate wasn't sealed, that the grey walls of the cargo hold weren't the boundaries of the universe, made the recycled air seem less poisonous. "Tell me about the ship," she said. "Everything you've observed. Crew patterns, security protocols, structural weaknesses. If we're going to die on Krieg anyway." Crane was quiet for several heartbeats, his weathered features showing the internal calculation of a man who'd learned that information was the most valuable currency in the void. When he spoke, it was with the measured tone of someone sharing state secrets. "The penitent's burden is a lunar-class cruiser, stripped of most weapon systems and converted for bulk transport. Crew complement probably around 15,000, though half of those are servitors or impressed ratings." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "The prisoner holds are in the lower decks, surrounded by cargo bays and engineering spaces. Multiple redundant containment systems, each one designed to prevent exactly what we're discussing. But every system has weaknesses." "True. But the biggest weakness isn't the ship, it's us." Crane's pale eyes met hers directly. "We're malnourished, exhausted, and surrounded by people who've given up. Any escape attempt would need to account for those factors." Over the next few days, their conversations took on a different character. What had begun as casual storytelling evolved into something that might charitably be called planning, though neither of them used that word aloud. Crane shared his observations about guard rotations, the timing of food distribution, the sounds that echoed through the hull during different shifts. "The night watch runs a skeleton crew," he mentioned during one discussion. "Probably half the guards, and those ones are usually the least experienced. They rely on the containment systems to do most of the work." "What about the other prisoners?" Lyra asked, glancing around the hold. "Would any of them—" "Most of them are already dead inside," Crane said bluntly. "The ones who aren't are too scared to risk what little life they have left. An escape attempt would be small numbers, maybe half a dozen people at most." The mathematics of survival were harsh but clear. Too few people, and they'd lack the resources to overcome the ship's security. Too many, and the plan would collapse under its own complexity, betrayed by fear or desperation. "There's something else," Crane said during their 10th day of conversations. "The ship's been running low on consumables. I can hear it in the atmospheric processes. They're working harder than they should be, recycling air that's already been through too many cycles. Food distribution has been reduced twice since we came aboard." "What does that mean?" "Means they're rationing for a longer journey than planned, or dealing with higher losses than expected. Either way, it suggests problems with the supply chain. Ships in distress make mistakes, cut corners, relax protocols. They shouldn't relax." Lyra felt the first stirring of something that might have been optimism. If the ship was struggling with basic logistics, perhaps their containment systems weren't as robust as they appeared. Perhaps the crew's attention was divided between maintaining the vessel and managing thousands of prisoners. "How long until we reach Krieg?" she asked. "Standard warp translation for this route. Maybe another week if we're lucky. Could be longer if they hit rough currents or need to make adjustments." Crane's expression grew thoughtful. "But there's something else. The ship's been maintaining course too perfectly. No deviations, no course corrections. That suggests either exceptional navigation or what? Or they're following a pre-programmed route. Automated systems handling the bulk of the piloting." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "If that's the case, then most of the bridge crew might be focused on other duties. Maintenance, logistics, dealing with problems in other parts of the ship." The implications were staggering. A skeleton crew running automated systems while dealing with supply shortages and prisoner management, exactly the kind of divided attention that might create opportunities for those desperate enough to seize them. "You're really considering this?" Lyra said. It wasn't a question. "I'm considering dying on my own terms instead of in a Krieg processing facility," Crane replied. "There's a difference." That night, as the hold settled into its restless approximation of sleep, Lyra stared at the overhead pipes and tried to imagine what lay beyond the ship's hull. Somewhere out there, past the metal walls and the void itself, other worlds spun through their orbits under foreign stars. Worlds where the Imperium's reach might be lighter, where a person might disappear into crowds of strangers and begin again. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. For someone who'd never travelled farther than the neighbouring hab blocks, the idea of choosing her own destination seemed almost blasphemous. But the alternative, arriving on Krieg to be processed like raw materials in the Emperor's industrial machine, made blasphemy seem like a reasonable risk. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept returning to Crane's stories of void clean air and worlds where the horizons stretched beyond comprehension. Somewhere in the darkness of the cargo hold, hope had taken root like a weed in concrete. Fragile and probably doomed, but undeniably alive. The penitent's burden continued its journey through the warp, carrying its cargo of human misery toward a dead world where even hope had been atomized centuries ago. But in the depths of cargo hold 8 Gamma, 2 voices whispered of possibilities that the Imperium had tried very hard to make them forget. Tomorrow, Lyra decided, she would ask Crane about the ship's layout in greater detail. Tonight, she would dream of stars. The nightmares came with the regularity of a ship's bell, marking the passage of time in the warp's twisted embrace. Lyra jerked awake for the third time that night, her coveralls soaked with cold sweat despite the cargo hold's stifling atmosphere. In her dreams, the bulkheads had been breathing, expanding and contracting like lung tissue, while whispered voices promised her things that her waking mind refused to remember. Around her, other prisoners tossed in their fitful sleep, some mumbling prayers, others crying out against horrors that existed only in the spaces between thoughts. The warp pressed against the ship's Geller field like a living thing, and even those without psychic sensitivity could feel its malevolent attention. She sat up carefully, trying not to disturb the man sleeping beside her, a former dock worker whose crime had been selling ration supplements to pregnant women. His breathing carried the rasp of someone whose lungs had been damaged by years of industrial chemicals, made worse by the ship's failing atmospheric systems. Across the hold, she could make out Crane's silhouette against the dim emergency lighting. He sat with his back against a support stanchion, eyes open, watching the darkness with the patient alertness of someone who'd learned that sleep in the warp was a luxury few could afford. She made her way toward him, stepping carefully over sleeping bodies and trying to avoid the worst of the deck plate stains. The metal felt cold beneath her feet, conducting the ship's vibrations directly into her bones. The thrumming of overtaxed engines, the wheeze of failing recyclers, the subtle stress harmonics that spoke of a vessel pushed beyond its design limits. "Can't sleep either," she whispered, as she settled beside him. Crane glanced at her, noting the tremor in her hands and the hollow look around her eyes. Warp dreams are worse on ships like this. Too many minds pressed together, all broadcasting their fears into the same confined space. His voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating a technical specification. The field generators aren't designed for this kind of psychic load. Lyra nodded, though she didn't fully understand the mechanics he was describing. What mattered was that the nightmares weren't just her weakness. They were a symptom of their collective situation, another way the journey was slowly grinding them down. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "about what you said. The atmospheric systems." Crane's attention focused on her with the intensity of a targeting auspex. "What about them?" "Listen." She held up a hand, and they both focused on the sounds filtering through the hold. The recyclers wheezed with each cycle, their rhythm irregular and labored. Somewhere in the ship's depths, a pump struggled against failing seals, creating a percussive beat that spoke of imminent breakdown. They're not just working harder, they're failing. "I've noticed. Question is what we can do about it." Lyra leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The guards are suffering too. I've seen them. That corporal who checks the restraints twice a day. He's been coughing up blood for the past 3 days. The woman who supervises food distribution. She can barely stand a full shift without taking atmospheric breaks." Crane's weathered features showed the first stirring of genuine interest. "Continue." "They need the systems fixed, but they're short-handed. You said it yourself. Skeleton crew, divided attention, too many problems for too few people." She paused, organizing her thoughts. "What if we volunteered? Claimed we had experience with atmospheric processing before our sentencing?" The idea hung in the stale air between them like a live grenade. Crane considered it with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned to evaluate risk in increments measured by heartbeats. "Atmospheric systems on a ship this size," he said slowly. "Access to multiple decks, engineering spaces, supply lockers, tools that could be repurposed, uniforms that might be left unattended." His pale eyes met hers. "It's not impossible." "I worked in the chemical processing district before my arrest," Lyra continued, her voice gaining confidence. "Filtration systems, atmospheric scrubbers, recycling plants. The principles are the same whether you're cleaning hive air or ship's atmosphere. And I've maintained life support on a dozen different vessels," Crane added. "Different classes, different configurations, but the basic systems follow Imperial standard patterns. Between us. Between us, we might actually be able to fix their problems. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of possibility settling over them like a blanket. Around them, the cargo hold continued its slow decay, prisoners moaning in their sleep, the steady drip of condensation from failing seals, the omnipresent stench of human misery mixed with industrial failure. "The risks," Crane said finally. "If we're caught lying about our expertise, they execute us for sabotage," Lyra acknowledged. "If we're caught trying to escape, they make examples of us. If we do nothing, we arrive on Krieg and get processed into servitors or genetic material. Those aren't good odds." "No, but they're odds. Better than the certainty we're facing now." Crane studied her face in the dim light, as if trying to gauge the depth of her commitment. "You understand what you're proposing? This isn't just an escape attempt. It's treason against the Imperium. If we succeed, we become enemies of the state. Hunted. There's no going back to whatever life you had before." "What life?" Lyra's voice carried a bitter edge. "A hab-block apartment I couldn't afford. A job that barely paid enough to survive. A tithe system designed to ensure I'd never escape poverty. They took that away the moment they sentenced me for a debt I tried 3 times to pay." She gestured at the cargo hold around them. "Look at this place. Look at what they've done to us. We're not citizens anymore. We're resources to be allocated. The only choice left is how we die." Crane nodded slowly, the gesture carrying the weight of old decisions and their consequences. "Then we plan properly. No rushing, no desperate moves. We observe, we prepare, and we move only when the opportunity is right. How do we volunteer without seeming suspicious?" "Leave that to me. I know how to speak the language these people understand. Efficiency, necessity, imperial service." Crane's expression hardened. "The trick is making them think it's their idea." Over the next 2 days, they refined their approach with the patience of career criminals. Crane would make the initial contact during the morning guard rotation when the crew was most tired and the atmospheric problems most obvious. He'd approach the guard sergeant with the deference of a former Imperial Navy rating, offering expertise in exchange for the privilege of serving the Emperor's will. "The key is humility," Crane explained during one of their whispered planning sessions. "We're not trying to escape. We're trying to redeem ourselves through service. We want to fix their problems because it's our duty as Imperial citizens, not because we're looking for advantage." "And if they don't believe us?" "Then we die a little sooner than planned. But I don't think they will. Not if we approach it correctly. The ship's in genuine distress, and desperate people make poor decisions." Lyra found herself studying the guards with new attention during their routine patrols. The signs of atmospheric poisoning were obvious once you knew what to look for. The slight tremor in hands, the shortness of breath, the way they favored breathing apparatus during longer duties. The woman who supervised food distribution had developed a persistent cough that left flecks of blood on her sleeve, while the corporal responsible for restraint checks moved with the careful deliberation of someone fighting constant dizziness. "They're dying too," she realized. "Slower than us, but still dying." "That's our advantage," Crane agreed. "Pride won't keep them alive if the atmospheric systems fail completely, and we're offering them a solution that doesn't require admitting weakness to their superiors." The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Volunteer their services as atmospheric specialists, gain access to the ship's engineering spaces, acquire tools and equipment that could be repurposed for other uses, obtain crew uniforms and identification that might allow them to move freely through the vessel, and then improvise. "The hardest part will be once we're out of the cargo hold," Crane warned. "Ship this size has thousands of crew members, most of whom we've never seen. Wrong corridor, wrong timing, wrong response to a challenge, and we're dead. But if we can make it work, we have options. Krieg is a major imperial world, dozens of ships in orbit at any given time. Military transports, supply vessels, civilian traders. If we can slip aboard one of them. The possibility hung between them like a prayer whispered in a cathedral of machinery and despair. Escape not just from the ship, but from their designated fate. The chance to disappear into the Imperium's vast bureaucracy, to become different people with different histories. When? Lyra asked. Crane listened to the ship's laboured breathing for a moment, his trained ear cataloguing the various failures and stress points. Tomorrow morning. The night shift will be tired, the day shift not yet fully alert. Atmospheric problems are always worse during shift changes. That's when the recyclers have to work hardest to compensate for increased activity. And if it doesn't work? Then we die as free people instead of slaves. There are worse fates. Lyra closed her eyes and tried to imagine what lay beyond the ship's hull, not the roiling nightmare of the warp, but what waited on the other side. Worlds where the Imperium's reach might be lighter, where a person with useful skills and careful habits might carve out a life that belonged to them instead of the state. The dream was dangerous and probably impossible. But it was theirs. And in the depths of cargo hold 8 Gamma, surrounded by the slow decay of human hope, that ownership felt like the most precious thing in the galaxy. "Tomorrow, then," she whispered. Around them, the penitent's burden continued its journey through the warp, carrying its cargo toward a world where even rebellion had been atomized centuries ago. But in the darkness between the recyclers' laboured breathing, 2 voices planned a different ending to their story. The Imperium had tried to reduce them to numbers in a ledger, resources to be allocated according to bureaucratic efficiency. Tomorrow, they would remind it that some things refused to be counted. The first day's work had been deliberately conservative. Crane and Lyra moved through the processing station with careful inefficiency, making enough repairs to show progress while ensuring plenty of problems remained. They'd cleared one filtration chamber of its worst contamination and replaced a few obviously failed seals, but left deeper issues untouched. Atmospheric circulation efficiency increased to 68%, Tech Servitor Gamma 49 announced as they completed their shift. Improvement noted, but systems remain below optimal parameters. Corporal Vass tested the air with cautious breaths, his expression showing marginal relief, but not the dramatic improvement he'd hoped for. "It's better, but still not right." "These systems have been neglected for months," Crane explained with practiced technical authority. "One day of work can't undo that kind of damage. We're making progress, but there are deeper problems. Blocked ducting, contaminated chambers we haven't accessed yet, distribution manifolds that need complete overhaul." Lyra nodded, wiping grimy hands on her coveralls. "The chemical filtration arrays are particularly bad. Catalytic converters are fouled solid, and the molecular sieves need complete replacement. That's delicate work. Rush it, and you could make things worse." The servitor's augmetic eye whirred as it processed their assessment. "Evaluation. Accurate. Complete system restoration requires sustained maintenance effort over multiple duty cycles." When they returned to cargo hold 8 Gamma that evening, the marginal improvement in air quality was noticeable but insufficient. Prisoners breathed slightly easier, but the oppressive weight of failing life support still pressed against their lungs. Other holds throughout the ship were reporting similar gradual improvements, enough to prove the work was valuable, not enough to declare victory. The next morning brought Guard Sergeant Kleizar with a decision that exceeded their wildest hopes. "Atmospheric improvements noted throughout affected sections," he announced, his pale eyes studying them with calculating attention. "Engineering Command has authorized extended work detail for complete system restoration." He paused, consulting a data slate that bore official seals and authorization codes. You'll be quartered in temporary holding adjacent to Processing Station 2 until repairs are completed, or we reach Krieg, whichever comes first. Constant work schedule, technical supervision, full tool access. Lyra felt her heart hammer against her ribs, but kept her expression neutral. Extended access to the ship's engineering sections, tools, and the freedom to move beyond the cargo hold's confines. It was more than they dared hope for. "We won't disappoint you, Sergeant," Crane replied with appropriate humility. "See that you don't. Corporal Vass will escort you to your new quarters. Tech Servitor Gamma 49 will provide ongoing supervision, but my understanding is that these repairs require human intuition as much as technical knowledge." The temporary holding was a repurposed storage bay adjacent to the processing station, barely 3 meters square, with 2 folding cots and a basic waste reclamation unit. But after weeks in the cargo hold's packed misery, the private space felt luxurious. More importantly, the bay's security was minimal, a simple electronic lock rather than the multiple redundant systems that contained the main prisoner holds. "Shift rotation every 8 hours. Vass explained as he activated the locking mechanism. "Servitor supervision during work periods, meal delivery twice daily." He paused, fixing them with a tired stare. "Don't give me reason to regret this arrangement." Once alone, Crane and Lyra maintained careful silence until they were certain no surveillance devices monitored their quarters. Only then did they allow themselves cautious optimism. "Extended access," Lyra whispered. "Tool privileges. And that servitor, it's focused on technical compliance, not security." "Better than we hoped," Crane agreed. "But we need to move carefully. Too much progress too fast, and they'll declare the job finished." Over the following days, they established a pattern that balanced genuine repair work with systematic exploration. Each morning brought them back to Processing Station 2, where they continued the careful work of restoring atmospheric systems while mapping the ship's layout through its maintenance infrastructure. The air ducting became their primary focus, kilometers of ventilation shafts that connected every section of the vessel, carrying life-giving atmosphere to crew quarters, cargo holds, and engineering spaces. The official reason for their ductwork was clearing debris and removing obstructions that impeded airflow. The unofficial reason was intelligence gathering on an unprecedented scale. "Primary ventilation trunk extends from here to the upper decks," Crane observed on their 3rd day, consulting schematic displays while his hands worked to clear accumulated debris from an access panel. "Branches serve crew quarters, bridge sections, and officer country." The ductwork revealed the ship's true condition. Decades of deferred maintenance had left the ventilation system clogged with everything from construction debris to makeshift repairs that violated basic engineering principles. They found broken equipment wedged into airflow channels, abandoned tools that had been left by previous maintenance crews, and structural damage that spoke of the vessel's violent military past. But they also found opportunity. "Look at this," Lyra called softly from deep within a maintenance tunnel. She'd been working to clear a particularly stubborn obstruction when her tools revealed something unexpected, a secondary access shaft that didn't appear on the official schematics. Crane squeezed into the narrow space beside her, his trained eye examining the hidden passage. "Retrofit work," he concluded. "Probably added during the conversion from military to penal transport. Emergency access for maintenance crews." The shaft extended upward through multiple decks, bypassing the security checkpoints and monitoring systems that controlled normal crew movement. Its original purpose had been providing emergency access to critical systems, but neglect had left it forgotten by current ship operations. "Where does it lead?" Lyra asked. They spent the better part of an hour carefully exploring the shaft, using maintenance lights to illuminate passages that hadn't seen human presence in years. The route climbed through service areas and utility corridors, emerging eventually into sections of the ship that housed crew quarters and operational facilities. "Upper Deck 7, Crane whispered as they peered through a ventilation grate into a corridor beyond. Crew berthing, mess facilities, maybe even uniform storage. Through the great slats, they could see Imperial Navy personnel moving about their duties, ratings in work coveralls, petty officers in dress uniforms, the occasional commissioned officer whose insignia marked them as specialists in various technical disciplines, the normal operations of a ship at void, carrying on despite the cargo of human misery in the holds below. "Shift changes at 6 a.m., 2 p.m. and 10 p.m., Crane observed, noting the patterns of movement in the corridor. "Skeleton crew during night watch, maybe 30% normal staffing." They retreated carefully, memorizing the route and noting landmarks that would allow them to navigate the passage in darkness if necessary. Back in Processing Station 2, they resumed their official duties with renewed focus, using the legitimate work to cover their exploration of the ship's hidden arteries. Each day brought new discoveries. A maintenance shaft that connected to the laundry facilities where crew uniforms were processed and stored. A service tunnel that provided access to communications equipment and navigation systems. An emergency passage that led toward the vessel's boat bays, where smaller craft waited in launch-ready status. "It's like the ship has two nervous systems," Lyra observed during one of their evening planning sessions. "The official corridors everyone uses, and this hidden network of maintenance access." "Most crew never see the maintenance infrastructure," Crane agreed. "They know it exists, but they don't think about it. To them, we're just another work detail clearing debris from places nobody important ever goes." The servitor's supervision proved manageable through careful manipulation of its programming priorities. As long as they showed steady progress on atmospheric improvements and filed regular technical reports, Gamma 77 remained focused on monitoring their work efficiency rather than their precise movements. When they disappeared into ductwork for hours at a time, the servitor recorded it as necessary maintenance activity. By the end of their first week of extended access, they'd mapped routes that could take them throughout the ship while avoiding most security choke points. They'd identified storage areas where crew uniforms and equipment were kept with minimal oversight. And they'd begun to understand the vessel's operational rhythms, the quiet periods when corridors emptied, the shift changes that created opportunities for unobserved movement. "We're building options," Crane said during one of their whispered conferences. "Multiple escape routes, equipment access, timing windows. When the moment comes." "If the moment comes," Lyra corrected. "We still need to reach Krieg to have any chance of transferring to another vessel." "True. But now we'll reach it with plans instead of just hope." The penitent's burden continued its journey through the warp, carrying its cargo of condemned souls toward their designated fate. But in the depths of Processing Station 7, 2 prisoners had begun to transform themselves from victims into something more dangerous. People with knowledge, tools, and the growing conviction that their story didn't have to end the way the Imperium had written it. The air grew cleaner each day, a testament to their legitimate skills and the careful balance they maintained between genuine repair work and covert intelligence gathering. And with each breath of improved atmosphere, they refined their understanding of the ship that would either carry them to death or provide the means of their escape. The ventilation shafts had become their domain over the past 10 days, a hidden network of passages that revealed the ship's secrets to those patient enough to crawl through kilometers of corrugated metal ducting. Each expedition brought new intelligence, guard rotation schedules observed through grating slats, crew quarters mapped by the sound of voices through thin bulkheads, storage areas catalogued by the smell of their contents. Lyra had grown accustomed to the claustrophobic embrace of the ductwork, her body adapting to the cramped spaces and awkward angles required to navigate the maintenance infrastructure. The work was legitimately necessary. Decades of neglect had left the ventilation system clogged with debris that impeded airflow, but it also provided perfect cover for reconnaissance. On their 11th day of extended access, she was working to clear a particularly stubborn obstruction in a primary trunk line when her tools encountered something that shouldn't have been there. She played her work light across the object blocking the airflow, fabric, synthetic leather, and something that made her stomach clench with recognition. A human form wedged into the ductwork, positioned where a massive circulation fan had been cycling air for Emperor knew how long. The circulation fan was a massive piece of equipment, meter-wide blades designed to move enormous volumes of air through the ship's respiratory system. It had been cycling regularly during their work, creating the constant background noise that masked their movements through the ductwork. What it had done to the crewmen who'd encountered it was mechanically efficient and utterly final. Lyra studied the blockage with growing realization. The body had been positioned where the fan's massive blades could reach, but only the head had been caught in the mechanical death trap. The rest of the corpse remained intact on her side of the housing, the neck ending in a clean mechanical amputation that spoke of industrial precision rather than violence. The implications made her pulse quicken. An Imperial Navy ratings uniform, complete with rank insignia, lying forgotten in a section of ductwork that saw no regular maintenance. The kind of identity that might allow movement through areas where prisoners would be shot on sight. She forced herself to examine the corpse more closely, looking for signs of decomposition in the ship's controlled atmosphere. The ductwork's sterile environment had preserved the body remarkably well. No obvious decay, minimal odor beyond the metallic scent of dried blood around the severed neck. The uniform was intact. Ratings stripes, ship's patch, technical specialization badges that would provide access to exactly the areas they'd been exploring. Without the head visible, there was no way to determine the crewman's identity, but the clothing told its own story of someone who'd worked the ship's atmospheric systems. The extraction was grimly practical work. Lyra used her maintenance tools to carefully separate the body from the fan housing, working around the mechanical obstruction with the kind of methodical precision that the situation demanded. The uniform came away in good condition. Blood-stained around the collar where the fan had done its work, but otherwise serviceable. She bundled the clothing into a maintenance bag, trying not to think about the circumstances that had led someone into the ductwork. In the Imperium's vast machinery of war and suffering, individual tragedies were statistical inevitabilities rather than personal losses. The journey back through the maintenance network felt different now, less like exploration and more like infiltration. She carried the dead ratings uniform in her maintenance bag, along with the tools of their escape from the fate the Imperium had planned for them. When she emerged from the ductwork at Processing Station 7, Crane took one look at her expression and immediately understood something significant had occurred. She quickly related her discovery, keeping her voice low while Tech Servitor Gamma 77 performed routine diagnostics on the atmospheric equipment. "Technical rating uniform," Crane observed quietly, examining the blood-stained clothing. "Atmospheric systems specialization would have access to exactly the areas we've been exploring." "But we need 2 uniforms," Lyra pointed out. Crane nodded toward the laundry facility passage they'd mapped days earlier. "Think you can manage another procurement run?" The laundry facility had been one of their most valuable discoveries, a section of the vessel where crew uniforms were processed with minimal oversight, supervised by servitors whose programming focused on cleaning efficiency rather than inventory control. During shift changes, the facility operated on automated systems, while human supervisors attended to other duties. Lyra timed her approach carefully, using the ventilation access they'd mapped. Through the grating, she could observe the facility's operational rhythm. Servitors moving uniforms through cleaning cycles, automated systems sorting and distributing clean clothing to storage lockers throughout the ship. When the facility entered its automated cycle, she made her move. The storage lockers lined the facility's walls in neat rows, each one coded for specific crew sections and uniform types. She found the section designated for technical ratings and quickly identified a locker that contained uniforms in approximately her size. The lock was a simple electronic mechanism designed to prevent casual theft rather than determined infiltration. Her improvised tools, legitimate maintenance equipment repurposed for less legitimate uses, made quick work of the locking mechanism. Inside, she found exactly what they needed: a complete technical ratings uniform, properly sized and bearing the ship's current markings. The theft took less than 3 minutes. She replaced the broken lock with a duplicate from her toolkit, identical in appearance but non-functional, designed to hide the breach until long after they'd need the equipment. By the time someone discovered the missing uniform, they'd either be dead or free. Back in Processing Station 7, she and Crane examined their acquisitions with the careful attention of people whose lives depended on details. 2 complete Imperial Navy uniforms, with appropriate rank insignia and technical specialization markings. Without proper identification documents, they'd need to rely on confidence and timing rather than documentation. "The fit's acceptable," Crane observed, holding up the blood-stained uniform against his frame. "Close enough to avoid attention, anyway." "What about identification checks?" Lyra asked, noting the absence of any tags or documentation with the corpse's clothing. "We'll have to bluff. Technical ratings on maintenance duties often work without full documentation. Emergency repairs, temporary assignments, the kind of situations where paperwork follows after the work is done." He paused, considering their options. It's riskier, but not impossible. They spent the remainder of their shift planning the next phase of their escape. The uniforms provided the means to move freely through crew areas, but they still needed timing and destination. Where could they go that wouldn't invite close inspection? How long could they maintain the deception before someone noticed ratings who didn't belong to any official duty roster? "Unused sections," Crane concluded. "Every ship this size has areas that aren't actively monitored. Storage bays, maintenance compartments, sections that were converted during the refit but never properly integrated into ship operations. And when we reach Krieg, we blend into whatever confusion comes with orbital insertion. Ships arriving, ships departing, cargo transfers, crew rotations, the kind of administrative chaos that creates opportunities for people who know how to exploit them." That evening, as they settled into their temporary quarters with the weight of stolen uniforms hidden beneath their bunks, the ship's intercom crackled to life with an announcement that changed everything. Captain Commander Thorne's voice echoed through the vessel's corridors with the authority of absolute command. "All hands, prepare for warp translation to real space. Estimated time to translation, 18 hours. Department heads report translation readiness by 6 a.m. tomorrow." That is all. 18 hours. Less than a day before they'd emerge into the Krieg system, where their window of opportunity would open and possibly close, with brutal finality. "This is it," Lyra whispered. Crane nodded, his weathered features showing the calm that came with decisions made and consequences accepted. Time to find out if hope is worth more than certainty. Around them, the penitent's burden began the complex preparations for translation back to real space. Crew members securing equipment, servitors running system diagnostics, and thousands of condemned prisoners who had no idea their fate would be decided in the next few hours. But in Processing Station 7, 2 people had stopped being prisoners and begun the transformation into something else entirely. What that something was remained to be seen, but it would be their choice rather than the Imperium's. The countdown to Krieg had begun. The guards' attention had shifted over the past few days as the ship prepared for translation. What had once been regular checks on their progress became perfunctory visits, with Corporal Vass barely glancing at their work before hurrying off to attend to more pressing duties. The atmospheric improvements they'd achieved were sufficient to keep the crew breathing, and with translation imminent, long-term repairs had become secondary to immediate operational concerns. "They're distracted," Lyra observed during their final day in Processing Station 7. Around them, the ship hummed with increased activity as departments prepared for the transition back to real space. Crane nodded, his weathered features showing the tension that came with approaching decision points. Translation prep takes priority over everything else. Security protocols get relaxed when the crew's focused on not dying during the jump. They'd refined their escape plan over the past 18 hours, identifying the optimal moment to disappear into the ship's hidden maintenance network. The confusion of translation would provide cover, while their technical rating uniforms would allow them to move through crew areas without immediate challenge. The moment they announce translation imminent, we go, Crane said, checking the chronometer on the processing station's main console. Guards will be securing their own stations. Crew will be focused on operational duties. Perfect window. Lyra felt her pulse quicken as she contemplated what lay ahead. Everything they'd planned, all the risks they'd taken, would be decided in the next few hours. Success meant freedom, or at least the chance to choose their own deaths. Failure meant spacing, if they were lucky. The ship's intercom crackled to life with the announcement they'd been waiting for. All hands, prepare for immediate translation to real space. Secure all loose gear, report to translation stations, prepare for Geller field disengagement. Translation in T-minus 30 minutes. Around them, tech servitor Gamma 77 began its translation preparations with mechanical precision, securing equipment and running final diagnostics on critical systems. The creature that had supervised their work for days showed no interest in their location during the approaching crisis. Its programming focused entirely on ensuring atmospheric systems remained functional during the dangerous transition. "Now," Crane whispered. They moved with practiced efficiency, gathering their stolen uniforms and the improvised tools they'd accumulated over days of legitimate maintenance work. The ventilation access they'd used for reconnaissance became their escape route, leading into the hidden network of passages that honeycombed the ship's superstructure. 20 minutes later, when Corporal Vass arrived to escort them back to prisoner holding for translation, he found Processing Station 7 empty, except for the servitor running pre-translation diagnostics. "Where are the work detail prisoners?" he demanded, his voice carrying the stress of someone already behind schedule. "Prisoners departed station 14 minutes ago," the servitor replied with mechanical precision. "No authorization recorded for departure." Vass stared at the empty chamber, his exhausted mind struggling to process the implications. With translation approaching, he faced a choice between searching for escaped prisoners or ensuring his own survival during the dangerous transition. The choice was obvious. "Secure the station," he ordered the servitor. "Report the missing prisoners after translation. Nothing else matters until we're back in real space." High above in the ship's ventilation system, Lyra and Crane moved through passages they'd mapped with painstaking care. The stolen uniforms felt strange against their skin. The synthetic fabric of Imperial Navy coveralls after weeks in prisoner greys, the weight of rank insignia and technical badges that represented identities they'd never earned. "Unused storage bay 77 Gamma," Crane whispered as they navigated a particularly narrow maintenance shaft. 3 decks up portside. Converted from weapons storage during the refit, but never properly integrated into ship operations. The journey took them through sections of ductwork they'd explored during their reconnaissance, past ventilation grates that offered glimpses of crew members securing their stations for translation. The ship's atmosphere crackled with tension as 15,000 souls prepared for the dangerous transition between dimensions. They reached their destination with minutes to spare. A cavernous storage bay that had once housed torpedo launchers and missile magazines. The conversion to civilian transport had left the space empty, except for abandoned equipment and the kind of forgotten supplies that accumulated in unused corners of large vessels. "Perfect," Lyra breathed, taking in the bay's isolation and the multiple exit routes they'd identified during their planning. "We can wait here until the confusion dies down, then make our move toward the boat bays." Crane moved to one of the bay's observation ports, peering through reinforced transparasteel at the void beyond. His expression carried a strange intensity, as if he was seeing something more than the swirling madness of the warp. "Lyra," he said quietly, There's something I need to tell you. It can wait, she replied, focused on securing their hiding place and checking the stolen uniforms for any identifying marks that might betray them. Once we're safely aboard another ship, once we're clear of Imperial space, then we can— No. Crane's voice carried an urgency that made her look up from her preparations. It has to be now, before we translate, before ... The ship's intercom interrupted him with the final warning that would change everything. All hands, brace for translation. Gellerfield disengagement in T-10 seconds. Emperor, protect us all. The translation hit like reality being turned inside out and reassembled by a madman. For one eternal instant, the storage bay existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Lyra could see through the bulkheads to impossible geometries, feel her consciousness stretched across light years while compressed into a single point of awareness. When the universe snapped back into its proper configuration, she found herself gasping on the deck plating, her vision swimming as her brain struggled to process the return to normal space-time. Around her, the storage bay's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as systems compensated for the violent transition. She looked around for Crane, expecting to find him similarly affected by the translation. Instead, she saw only an empty Imperial Navy uniform lying crumpled on the deck beside her, coveralls, rank insignia, and technical badges arranged as if someone had simply vanished from within them. For several heartbeats, she stared at the empty clothing in confusion. Then her eyes focused on the name tape sewn above the left breast pocket, and her blood turned to ice in her veins. Crane. T. Atmospheric Systems, Tech 3rd Class. The uniform she'd pulled from a headless corpse in the ship's ventilation system. The identity they'd planned to use for their escape. The man who'd spent weeks planning their freedom, sharing stories of void service and worlds beyond imagination. The man who'd never existed at all. Understanding crashed over her like a physical blow. The warp. The realm where thought became reality, where the boundaries between consciousness and existence grew thin, where the desperate need for hope and companionship could manifest as something that seemed entirely real. She was alone. Had always been alone. The stolen uniform from the laundry facility lay beside her, her only remaining link to the identity she'd planned to assume. Around her, the storage bay hummed with the sounds of a ship that had successfully translated to real space, carrying its cargo of condemned souls toward their final destination. But she was no longer just cargo. She had tools, she had a plan, and she had the knowledge that Crane, real or not, had helped her acquire. The ghost of a dead rating had given her something more valuable than companionship, the belief that escape was possible. Through the observation port, she could see the first glimpse of stars that weren't filtered through the warp's madness. Real stars, marking the location of the Krieg system and whatever opportunities awaited there. She picked up the empty uniform that bore Crane's name, folding it carefully. Whatever he had been, warp phantom, manifestation of desperate hope, or something else entirely, he'd been real enough to matter. Real enough to help her transform from victim to something approaching free. The penitent's burden continued its approach to Krieg, carrying thousands of prisoners toward their designated fate. But in Storage Bay 77 Gamma, one person prepared to write a different ending to her story. Chapter 4. 851.M40, Forge World Mars, Subsector Helix Terminus. Tech Dominus Vex Cythera stared at the failure report scrolling across his data slate, each line of statistics representing another collapse in Project Terminus. The artificial womb protocols had achieved their theological objectives. Every child born through accelerated gestation possessed a complete soul, their psychic resonance indistinguishable from naturally conceived humans. But the logistics were proving catastrophic. Subject mortality rates? He queried, though the numbers were already burned into his augmetic memory cores. 87% within the first year, Tech Adept Zorin reported, her mechadendrites weaving through holographic displays that painted the laboratory in sickly green light. The accelerated pregnancy cycles are causing complete systemic failure. Organ breakdown, skeletal deterioration, psychological collapse. We're losing subjects faster than we can acquire replacements. Vex Kithera's flesh hand traced along his jaw, an old habit from his pre-augmentation days that even decades of mechanical enhancement hadn't erased. The mathematics were inexorable. To meet Krieg's recruitment quotas, they needed sustainable production of approximately 50,000 soldiers annually. The current artificial womb system required 15,000 women in continuous rotation, but with an 87% annual mortality rate, they would need to acquire and process over 100,000 new subjects each year just to maintain operational capacity. Even the Imperium's vast resources had limits. "Alternative methodologies?" he asked, already knowing his research team had been exploring every possible solution. Magos biologist Harrax skittered forward on his spider-like augmetic assembly, servo arms manipulating holographic models of human reproductive anatomy. "We've identified the core limitation, Dominus. The human female reproductive system evolved for single gestations with extended recovery periods. Our attempts to accelerate the process are fundamentally incompatible with baseline human physiology." Vex Kithera nodded grimly. They had pushed human biology to its absolute limits and found those limits wanting. Elaboration? The pelvic structure restricts the number of simultaneous pregnancies. The endocrine system cannot sustain continuous hormone cycling. The cardiovascular system fails under the metabolic load of multiple accelerated gestations. The psychological trauma of constant birth cycles triggers complete mental breakdown within months. Each limitation had been documented through careful experimentation. Subjects who showed initial promise would deteriorate rapidly once the full protocol began. The lucky ones died quickly from organ failure. The unlucky ones lived long enough to experience complete psychological fragmentation before their bodies finally gave out. "However," Harrax continued, "we have identified a theoretical solution that addresses each of these constraints." The holographic display shifted, showing a hybrid organism that bore only passing resemblance to human anatomy. Vex Kithera studied the projection with growing interest and growing horror at its implications. "Explain," he commanded. "Complete reconstruction of the reproductive subject through servitorization," Harrax began, his vox grill crackling with mechanical enthusiasm. "We preserve the essential biological components required for gestation while replacing inefficient human systems with optimized mechanical alternatives." The projection rotated, revealing the full scope of the proposed modifications. The torso remained recognizably human, but everything else had been replaced with mechanical components designed for maximum efficiency. Most striking was the enlarged abdominal cavity, a transparent biosac capable of housing dozens of developing embryos simultaneously. "The lower body is replaced with a mechanical ambulatory platform based on arachnid locomotion principles," Harrax continued. 8 articulated legs provide stability and mobility while supporting the increased weight of multiple gestations. The abdominal cavity is expanded through surgical reconstruction, incorporating synthetic muscle walls and artificial circulation systems capable of sustaining 48 simultaneous pregnancies. Tech Adept Uriel raised a servo arm in query. "Psychological stability concerns? Previous subjects suffered complete mental breakdown from extended pregnancy cycles." "Lobotomization," Vex Kithera said immediately, understanding the design's elegance. "Full servitor conversion eliminates psychological trauma by eliminating higher brain function." "Precisely," Harrax confirmed. "The subjects would retain only basic biological functions necessary for gestation: hormonal regulation, circulation, basic maternal responses. All higher cognitive functions are severed and replaced with machine logic programmed for optimal reproductive efficiency." The solution was both brilliant and horrifying in its thoroughness. By converting the subjects into biological machines, they would eliminate every limitation that had plagued the artificial womb project. No psychological trauma, no biological limits, no mortality from repeated stress. Just efficient reproductive servitors capable of continuous operation. Gestation periods? Zorin asked. Reduced to 4 months through enhanced nutritional support and chemical acceleration, Harrix replied. Each servitor unit can produce 144 offspring annually with minimal maintenance requirements. Vex Cathera performed the calculations instantly. 350 womb-servitors could meet Krieg's annual recruitment quotas while providing significant redundancy for operational losses. The resource requirements would be a fraction of the current system's demands. Theological compliance, he inquired. Full adherence to imperial doctrine, Harrix assured him. Natural conception occurs through artificial insemination using harvested genetic material from proven death core templates. Gestation proceeds through biological processes within living tissue. The soul is bestowed through the Emperor's grace as intended. The only modification is optimization of the delivery system. The first prototype was designated Womb-Servitor Unit 01. The subject had been a middle-aged woman from the Cadian agri-worlds, sentenced to penal servitude for unauthorized grain distribution. Her crime ticker had noted adequate reproductive capacity and stable psychological profile, factors that had made her suitable for the conversion process. The lobotomization was performed first, using standard servitor protocols to sever the higher brain functions while preserving the autonomic systems necessary for biological function. Her memories, personality, and capacity for suffering were cut away with surgical precision, leaving only the biological framework necessary for reproduction. The mechanical augmentation followed. Her legs were amputated at the hip, replaced with 8 articulated limbs that provided stability and mobility while distributing weight across multiple contact points. The arachnid design was both practical and symbolic. Spiders were among the most efficient reproductive creatures in nature, capable of producing hundreds of offspring with minimal resource investment. Her torso was opened and restructured, the abdominal cavity expanded to accommodate the transparent biosac that would serve as a womb for dozens of simultaneous pregnancies. Synthetic muscle fibers and mechanical circulation systems were integrated with her remaining biological components, creating a hybrid organism optimized for continuous gestation. The first test began with 12 embryos implanted directly into the biosac's nutritional matrix. Each embryo was enclosed in its own amniotic chamber while sharing resources through the servitor's enhanced circulation system. Vex Cathera monitored the development with growing satisfaction as the embryos progressed through accelerated development cycles. Vital signs remained stable, Zorin reported after the first week. All 12 embryos showing normal development patterns. The servitor unit requires minimal maintenance, basic nutritional supplements and mechanical lubrication of the locomotor assembly. But it was the unexpected behavioral patterns that truly validated their approach. Despite the lobotomization, the womb servitor had begun exhibiting primitive maternal responses. It would move through the laboratory spaces in slow, deliberate patterns, the mechanical legs clicking against the floor in a rhythm that seemed almost soothing. When it paused, the remaining fragments of its vocal cords would produce soft humming sounds, wordless melodies that penetrated the laboratory's sterile atmosphere. Residual maternal instincts, Harrix observed. The lobotomization preserved basic reproductive behaviors while eliminating higher cognitive functions. The unit is responding to hormonal triggers from the developing embryos. Vex Cathera was fascinated by this development. They had created a being that possessed all the biological advantages of motherhood while lacking the psychological vulnerabilities that had doomed their previous subjects. The womb servitor could not suffer because it could not understand suffering. It could not despair because it possessed no capacity for hope. The first gestation cycle concluded successfully 4 months later. 12 healthy infants were extracted from the biosac through automated delivery systems, each one possessing the physical perfection of their genetic templates and the spiritual wholeness that natural birth provided. The womb-servitor showed no distress at the separation. Its programming simply initiated the next reproductive cycle. Efficiency exceeded projections, Vex Kithra noted with satisfaction. Unit 01 produced 12 viable offspring with minimal resource investment and 0 psychological complications. Scaling to full production levels is now theoretically achievable. But the prototype had revealed another requirement that hadn't been considered in their original calculations. The offspring require socialization protocols, Zoran observed. Human infants need maternal contact for proper neurological development. The servitor units can provide the biological aspects of motherhood, but they lack the cognitive capacity for emotional bonding. This presented a new challenge. The Death Corps' effectiveness depended on their fierce loyalty to the Emperor and their brothers in arms. That loyalty developed through early childhood experiences of protection and sacrifice. If their artificially gestated soldiers lacked proper emotional development, they might possess the physical capabilities of the Death Corps, but none of the spiritual fire that made them effective. Solution? Vex Kithra inquired. Programmed maternal vocalizations, Harrick suggested. We install Vox units in each servitor programmed with recordings of maternal speech patterns, lullabies, encouragement, basic emotional comfort sounds. The units would provide appropriate auditory stimulation during gestation and early development. Additionally, Uriel added, we could program the servitor units to perform maternal movement patterns, walking, rocking motions, gentle manipulation of the biosac contents. The developing embryos would experience appropriate physical stimulation that mimics natural maternal behavior. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. They would program each womb-servitor with recordings of loving mothers, voices harvested from among the condemned women before their conversion. Sweet nothings, gentle songs, words of encouragement and protection. The servitors would repeat these sounds throughout gestation, providing the emotional foundation necessary for proper human development. Within a year, the first production facility was operational on Krieg itself. 350 womb-servitors moved through the converted manufactorums in endless maternal circuits, their mechanical legs clicking against ferrocrete floors while their Vox units whispered love to the dozens of children growing within their transparent biosacs. Each servitor had been programmed with different maternal voice patterns to provide variety in early childhood experiences. Some spoke in the gentle tones of Cadian mothers, others in the harsh but loving voices of Hive-world women. The recordings played continuously, creating a symphony of artificial motherhood that echoed through the facility's corridors. The servitors themselves moved with purpose, following programmed routes that provided appropriate exercise and stimulation for the developing embryos. They would pause at designated feeding stations, allowing mechanical systems to replenish their nutritional supplies, then continue their maternal wandering through the facility's halls. From a distance, they might have resembled some nightmarish hybrid of mother and machine. But to the dozens of children growing within their biosacs, they were perfect, providing all the biological and emotional nurturing necessary for proper human development, while lacking the capacity for the fatigue, despair, or rebellion that had limited their predecessors. The first generation of womb-servitor offspring emerged as perfect Death Corps specimens. Their souls burned with the Emperor's light. Their bodies possessed the enhanced capabilities of their genetic templates, and their early exposure to endless maternal love had created beings capable of fierce loyalty and selfless sacrifice. As Vex Kithra observed the latest batch of newborns being transferred to the vat growth facilities for accelerated maturation, he reflected on the project's theological implications. They had succeeded in creating artificial mothers who loved without the capacity for suffering, who sacrificed without understanding loss, who gave life without fearing death. Perhaps, he mused, They had created the most perfect mothers in the galaxy. On Krieg, 350 womb-servitors continued their endless maternal wandering, whispering love to the children who would never know they had once been women, carrying the future of the Death Corps in biosacks that glowed with the promise of endless war. The Emperor protects, and sometimes his protection required the most beautiful monsters imaginable. Chapter 5. The sound of boots in the corridor outside Storage Bay 77 Gamma came without warning, the measured cadence of a tactical team moving with purpose rather than routine patrol. Lyra's blood froze as she recognized the difference, her hand halfway to the stolen uniform when the bay's main hatch cycled open with a pneumatic hiss. "Contact! One prisoner! Unauthorized location!" The voice cracked with authority as combat lumens flooded the storage bay, turning the shadows into stark relief. Guard Sergeant Kleizar entered, flanked by 4 guardsmen in full riot gear, their flak armor bearing the scuff marks of extended service aboard the prison transport. Each man carried a combat shotgun, loaded with solid slugs, weapons designed to put down human targets with brutal efficiency. Their movements spoke of veterans who'd cleared contested spaces before, covering angles and blocking escape routes with practiced precision. Lyra's training from the chemical processing plants kicked in automatically. Hands visible, no sudden movements, project compliance rather than threat. She remained kneeling beside the empty uniform, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run or fight or do anything except submit to the inevitable. "Prisoner Casella, Lyra," Kleizar announced, consulting a data slate while his men maintained their weapons ready. "Escaped from authorized work detail during translation preparations. Explain your presence in this restricted area." Behind her, the folded uniform bearing Crane's name lay just within reach, but moving toward it would mean death under the guards' weapons. Instead, she kicked backward with her heel, sending the bundle of clothing sliding behind a nearby equipment crate where it disappeared into the bay's accumulated debris. "We were trying to get back to processing station 7 before translation," she said, letting desperation color her voice. Not difficult, given the circumstances. The passages all looked the same, and when the alarms started... She gestured helplessly at the storage bay around them. "We got turned around. Ended up here when everything went to hell." "We?" Kleizar's pale eyes swept the bay, noting the lack of other prisoners. "Where is your work detail partner?" The question hung in the recycled air like a blade. Lyra's mind raced through possible explanations, settling on the one most likely to be believed. "Lost him during translation. The passages... Something went wrong. One moment he was right behind me. Next moment..." She let her voice trail off, hoping they'd fill in their own assumptions. Kleizar activated his voxcaster, the device crackling with static as it connected to the ship's command structure. "Bridge, this is Detention Team 7. We have recovered one escaped prisoner from Storage Bay 77 Gamma. Request confirmation of warp anomaly readings for this location." The response came immediately, distorted by interference but clearly audible. "Confirmed, Sergeant. Massive psychic disturbance detected in that section during translation. Residual energy readings suggest manifestation event, possibly a warp echo or phantom projection." Lyra felt her stomach clench as the pieces fell into place. They knew. Somehow the ship's sensors had detected Crane's presence and his disappearance during the translation back to real space. The manifestation event would explain everything to their satisfaction. A desperate prisoner's mind creating a companion from warp energy, only to have that creation dissolve when they returned to reality. "Understood, Bridge." Kleizar studied Lyra with the calculating gaze of someone who'd seen every variation of prisoner deception. "Psychic resonance explains the phantom companion. Subject was likely experiencing warp-induced hallucinations during the extended exposure to translation energies." One of the guardsmen, a scarred veteran whose shock maul bore the wear marks of frequent use, stepped closer to examine her more carefully. "Could be warp-touched, sir. might need purging just to be safe. The suggestion carried the casual brutality that marked imperial justice. Better to execute a potentially contaminated prisoner than risk psychic contagion spreading through the ship. Lyra kept her expression neutral, while her mind calculated survival odds that weren't encouraging. "Negative," Kleizar decided, after consulting his data slate. "Subject shows no signs of mutation or aberrant behavior. Psychological break from isolation stress. Nothing more." He paused, fixing her with a stare that promised unpleasant consequences. Though unauthorized movement during translation prep is still a capital offense. The guards formed up around her with the efficiency of people who'd performed this procedure countless times. Shock mauls activated with electric hums, their crackling energy serving as both threat and promise. Any resistance would be met with immediate pacification. "On your feet, prisoner. Hands behind your back." The restraints bit into her wrists with familiar bite, metal cuffs that had been designed for compliance rather than comfort. As they secured her arms, Lyra caught one last glimpse of the equipment crate where the stolen uniform lay hidden. Her only remaining link to the identity she'd planned to assume, now abandoned in a storage bay she'd likely never see again. The march back to prisoner holding took them through corridors that hummed with post-translation activity. Crew members moved with the focused urgency of people dealing with system problems and equipment failures that always followed warp travel, their faces showing the relief that came with successful return to real space. Through reinforced viewports, Lyra caught her first glimpse of the Krieg system, a distant star that cast pale light across the void, accompanied by the geometric shapes of orbital installations and the moving points of light that marked other vessels. Somewhere among those distant contacts lay the ships that might have carried her to freedom if circumstances had been different. "Keep moving," Kleizar ordered as she slowed to observe the view. "Save the sightseeing for when you're dead." The detention block felt smaller after her weeks of relative freedom in the ship's engineering spaces. The familiar stench of unwashed humanity and failing life support hit her like a physical blow, while the press of bodies and the constant background noise of despair reminded her what she'd temporarily escaped. Cargo Hold 7 had been reorganized during her absence. The surviving prisoners had been consolidated into tighter formations, their restraint points adjusted to accommodate the losses from warp exposure and the systematic culling that had reduced their numbers. Maybe 150 remained from the original 300, their faces bearing the hollow stare of people who'd given up hope. "Welcome back," whispered the elderly woman who'd been praying since the journey began. "We thought you were dead." Lyra settled into her assigned position, feeling the weight of restraints that marked her return to prisoner status. Around her, other survivors moved with the careful deliberation of people whose spirits had been systematically broken by weeks of degradation and loss. But something had changed inside her during those days of freedom. The knowledge that escape was possible, that the ship's security could be beaten, that there were places beyond the reach of imperial justice. That knowledge couldn't be taken away by restraints or guards or the grinding machinery of penal transport. Crane might have been a warp phantom, a manifestation of desperate hope given temporary form by the realm of impossibility. But the skills he'd taught her, the routes he'd helped her map, the uniform that lay hidden in Storage Bay 77 Gamma, those were real. Tools she could use if another opportunity presented itself. Through the cargo holds overhead speakers, Captain Commander Thorne's voice announced their arrival with bureaucratic precision. "Attention, prisoners. We have successfully translated to the Krieg system. Orbital insertion will commence in 6 hours. Prepare for final processing and planetary transfer." 6 hours. Lyra closed her eyes and began to plan, drawing on everything Crane had taught her about the ship's layout and operational patterns. The uniform was still hidden in the storage bay. The ventilation routes still existed. And orbital insertion would bring chaos, the kind of administrative confusion that created opportunities for those prepared to seize them. She'd learned something important during her brief taste of freedom. The difference between hope and certainty. Hope was what sustained you through suffering. Certainty was what got you killed. But somewhere between the two lay possibility, and that was something worth fighting for. The penitent's burden continued its approach to Krieg, carrying its cargo of condemned souls toward their designated processing. But in cargo hold 7, one prisoner had stopped thinking like cargo and began thinking like someone who still had choices to make. The countdown to Krieg continued, but the ending was no longer written in stone. Chapter 6. 853.M40, Krieg Prime Facility Designation Materna Terminus. Tech Dominus Vex Cythera stood on the observation deck overlooking Production Sector 7, one of 43 identical facilities that stretched across Krieg's ravaged landscape like mechanical forests of flesh and steel. Below him, 100,000 womb-servitors moved in their endless maternal circuits, their mechanical legs creating a percussion that echoed through the massive chamber like rainfall on metal. The mathematics had been sobering. Krieg's annual quota had been revised upward again. 3.2 million Death Corps soldiers required annually to feed the Imperium's endless wars. The initial test facility, with its 350 units, had proven the concept's viability, but scaling to meet actual demand had required a complete restructuring of the planet's industrial capacity. "Current production figures, Margos?" Vex Cythera queried through his voxlink. Margos, biologists. Harrix's response crackled with static interference from the facility's massive bioelectrical systems. Sector 7 maintaining optimal efficiency, Dominus. 100,000 active womb-servitors, average gestation load of 42 embryos per unit, cycle completion every 3.7 months. Projected annual output, 4.3 million viable specimens. The numbers were staggering. Sector 7 alone could exceed Krieg's recruitment quotas, but redundancy was essential. Equipment failures, servitor breakdowns, and the occasional warp storm disruption meant maintaining capacity across multiple facilities was the only way to ensure consistent delivery. "Facility-wide status report!" Vex Cythera commanded. Data streamed across his augmetic displays as reports flooded in from across the planet. 43 production sectors, each housing between 75,000 and 125,000 womb-servitors depending on their specific configuration. Total active units, 4.2 million. Projected annual output, 180 million Death Corps specimens. The scale was almost incomprehensible. They had transformed an entire world into a biological factory, its surface dominated by the massive cathedral-like structures that house the endless armies of artificial mothers. Between the facilities, specialized transport networks carried raw materials, genetic templates, nutritional supplements, replacement mechanical components, while similar systems exported the finished products to vat growth complexes, where the infants would be raised to fighting age. "Resource consumption analysis?" Vex Cythera inquired. "Significant but manageable," reported Tech Adept Zorin from her monitoring station deep within the facility. "Current operations require 847,000 tons of bionutritional supplements monthly, 342,000 replacement mechanical components, and approximately 190,000 new servitor conversions annually to offset operational losses." The human cost was equally staggering. Nearly 200,000 women annually had to be acquired, processed, and converted to maintain the system's operational capacity. The Departamento Munitorum's prisoner transport networks had been completely restructured to feed Krieg's appetite for biological raw materials. Vex Cythera descended from the observation deck to the production floor itself, his augmetic legs carrying him between the endless rows of womb-servitors. Each unit moved in its programmed pattern. Slow, deliberate steps that provided appropriate motion for the developing embryos while conserving mechanical energy. The transparent biosacs glowed with bioluminescent markers that indicated development stages, creating a constellation of life that stretched beyond visual range. The Vox units provided a constant symphony of artificial motherhood, thousands of voices whispering love, encouragement, and comfort in every language of the Imperium. The recordings had been harvested from condemned women during their final processing, their last gift to the children they would carry after their personalities were surgically removed. Unit Designation 7, Alpha 941847, Vex Kithera spoke to one servitor as it passed. The mechanical spider body paused, its sensors recognizing his authority codes. Status report, Unit. The servitor's Vox grill crackled before producing the flat monotone of programmed responses. Gestational load, 44 active specimens. Development progress, nominal across all embryos. Estimated delivery, 18 standard days. Nutritional requirements, adequate. Mechanical systems, operational. Vex Kithera examined the biosac's contents through the transparent walls. Dozens of small forms floated in their individual amniotic chambers, each one developing according to the accelerated timeline that would produce mature infants in less than 4 months. The sight should have been beautiful. New life growing under controlled conditions, each child destined for service to the Emperor. Instead, it filled him with a cold satisfaction that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with efficiency metrics being exceeded. "Continue operations," he commanded, and the servitor resumed its maternal wandering. The scale of the operation had required innovations beyond the original design. The early prototype facilities had used individual biosacs for each womb servitor, but the resource requirements proved prohibitive when multiplied across millions of units. The current generation employed modular biochambers that could be expanded or contracted based on gestational loads, allowing each servitor to carry between 30 and 50 embryos depending on their developmental stage. Transportation between facilities occurred through specialized rail networks designed to minimize disruption to gestational cycles. Womb-servitors requiring maintenance or replacement components were moved in climate-controlled cars that maintained optimal conditions for their biological cargo. The sight of trains carrying thousands of artificial mothers through Krieg's irradiated landscape had become as common as the Death Corps regiments marching to war. The vat growth facilities represented another massive industrial undertaking. The 180 million infants produced annually required rapid maturation to fighting age through chemical acceleration and intensive conditioning. Enormous complexes housed millions of growth tanks where Death Corps soldiers developed from newborns to mature warriors in less than 3 years. "Dominus," Harrix's Vox transmission carried an undertone of concern. "We are receiving reports from the outer production sectors. Facilities 31 through 37 are showing decreased efficiency ratings." Vex Kithera paused his inspection tour. "Elaboration?" "Mechanical component failures are exceeding replacement capacity. The outer sectors have been operational for nearly 2 years without major overhauls. We're beginning to see systematic breakdowns in the ambulatory assemblies." The problem was inevitable given the scale of operations. Each womb servitor represented a complex integration of biological and mechanical systems operating under constant stress. The mechanical legs alone endured millions of steps annually while carrying loads far exceeding normal human capacity. Component wear was accelerated by Krieg's corrosive atmosphere and the industrial chemicals required for facility maintenance. "Recommended solutions?" Vex Kithera asked. "Expanded manufacturing capacity for replacement components," Harrix replied immediately. "Current production can maintain 3.5 million active units. To support 4.2 million units long-term, we need a 30% increase in mechanical component output." "Additionally," Zorin added, "we should consider rotating servitor units through maintenance cycles. Brief periods of inactivity would allow complete component replacement and biological system maintenance." The logistics were staggering. Rotating 4.2 million units through maintenance cycles would require temporary storage facilities for their biological cargo, backup servitors to maintain production quotas, and expanded technical staff to perform the work. The resource requirements would strain even Krieg's vast industrial capacity. But the alternative was systematic failure across the entire production network. "Authorize expansion of maintenance facilities," Vex Kithera commanded. "Priority classification, Hereticus Maximus. Redirect resources from non-essential planetary operations as required." On Krieg, there were no non-essential operations except for the production of Death Corps soldiers. Mining, manufacturing, agriculture, everything existed to support the endless cycle of birth, growth, and deployment that fed the Imperium's wars. As Vex Kithera continued his inspection, he reflected on the theological implications of their achievement. They had created a world where motherhood had been perfected through the marriage of flesh and steel, where love was programmed and distributed on industrial scales, where the Emperor's gift of souls was mass-produced with the efficiency of an ammunition factory. The womb-servitors around him continued their endless maternal wandering, each one a perfect mother, stripped of everything that might interfere with maternal function. They loved without condition, because they could not understand conditions. They sacrificed without complaint, because they possessed no capacity for complaint. They gave life without fearing death, because death was simply another parameter in their programming. Perhaps, Vex Kithera mused as he watched millions of artificial mothers nurturing the next generation of the galaxy's finest soldiers, they had achieved something greater than efficiency. They had created perfect love. Love without limitations, without expectations, without the weakness of human emotion. In the distance, transport ships lifted off from landing pads carrying the latest production runs to war zones across the galaxy. Millions of Death Corps soldiers raised by mechanical mothers who had whispered artificial love into their developing ears, shaped by programmed affection that never wavered or failed. The Emperor protects, and his protection flowed through the transparent biosacs of 4.2 million perfect mothers who had forgotten they were ever anything else. Production quotas would be met. The Imperium's wars would continue. And on Krieg, the endless symphony of mechanical motherhood would play on until the galaxy's last battle was fought and won. Chapter 7. The transport's rear ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss, revealing Lyra's first glimpse of Krieg's surface. The sight was unlike anything she had imagined, a landscape of mud and ash stretching to the horizon, broken by the geometric shapes of industrial structures and the distant glow of what might have been cities. The sky was the color of old blood, and the air that rushed into the transport carried the metallic tang of radiation and chemical processing. Her legs nearly buckled as she stumbled down the ramp, her body still reeling from the brutal descent and the crushing compression of 80 bodies packed into standing room only. The woman beside her, a former factory worker whose crime had been organizing an illegal strike, collapsed to her knees on the metal grating, retching from the combination of claustrophobia and atmospheric shock. "Keep moving," barked a guard, whose voice carried the flat authority of someone who had given this command countless times. "Form up in lines of 20. Anyone who falls gets left behind." Imperial guardsmen in grey uniforms stood in precise formation around the landing zone, their faces hidden behind breathing masks that gave them an inhuman appearance. They moved with mechanical precision, their weapons held at ready positions, their postures identical in every detail. As Lyra shuffled into formation with the other prisoners, she found herself studying the guards more closely. They were all men, every single one of them. No women among the guards, no female personnel visible at the processing facility, no diversity in the ranks of soldiers who supervised the prisoner transfer with emotionless efficiency. And they all looked disturbingly similar. The same height, the same build, the same movements. As if they had been manufactured rather than born, shaped by some process that eliminated individual variation in favor of standardized efficiency. Around the vast landing zone, more transports were settling onto their landing struts with metallic screams and clouds of superheated vapor. Each craft disgorged its human cargo with mechanical precision, dozens of vessels delivering thousands of prisoners to the industrial complex that sprawled across the horizon like a mechanical cancer. But as Lyra watched the other prisoner groups forming up, a pattern emerged that made her stomach clench with unease. The systematic culling during the voyage hadn't been random. While there were still men among the survivors, the vast majority of prisoners stumbling from the transports were women, and not just any women, but those in their prime reproductive years. Her mind felt foggy, distorted by the warp's lingering effects, but she struggled to remember the demographics of their original cargo hold. The elderly woman who had prayed throughout the voyage, when had she disappeared? The older men who had formed hierarchies during the journey, where were they now? The memories felt slippery, as if important details had been deliberately obscured. What remained was a mass of perhaps 30,000 prisoners, with women under 40 comprising what looked like 70% of the survivors. Their faces showed the hollow exhaustion of people who had been systematically broken by the machinery of imperial justice, but their bodies still possessed the biological functions that had apparently determined their survival. "Prisoner separation protocols now in effect," announced a guard bearing the insignia of a processing officer. "Male subjects proceed to processing gate 7. Female subjects proceed to processing gate Alpha. Maintain formation. No talking, no delays, no exceptions." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. Separation. Not just from the ship, but specifically by gender. Around her, the thousands of survivors began to split into two streams. Perhaps 8,000 men moving toward Gate 7, over 20,000 women toward Gate Alpha. But as she moved with the female group, Lyra caught sight of something that made her blood turn to ice. Through the chain-link fencing that separated the processing areas, she could see the facilities that awaited each group. The men were being marched toward large industrial buildings that looked like standard labor processing centers, grim but recognizable as places where human beings might work, even under harsh conditions. The women, however, were being directed toward a different set of structures, buildings that glowed with an eerie bioluminescent light and hummed with the sound of massive machinery. The air around the female processing facility shimmered with heat distortion, and through the transparent sections of the building walls she could see shapes moving that defied easy classification. "Move along," urged a guard whose breathing mask couldn't quite hide the mechanical quality of his voice. "Processing schedule allows no delays." As they approached processing gate Alpha, Lyra noticed that the other women in their group were showing signs of increasing distress. Some were weeping silently, others had the hollow stare of people who had moved beyond fear into catatonic acceptance. The factory worker who had collapsed earlier was now being supported by two other prisoners, her legs too weak to carry her weight. Through the gate's chain-link barriers, Lyra could see the processing facility that awaited them. It was a massive complex of interconnected buildings that stretched beyond visual range, their surfaces covered with pipes, vents, and mechanical structures that defied easy classification. The sound of machinery created a constant industrial symphony that spoke of processes operating on an almost incomprehensible scale. But it was the shapes moving within the facility that made her stomach revolt. Through the transparent sections of the building walls, she could see things that might once have been human. Mechanical constructs that moved with purposeful intent, but bore only passing resemblance to normal anatomy. They walked on too many legs, their torsos elongated and distorted, their forms suggesting a marriage of flesh and machine that had produced something neither fully alive nor completely mechanical. "Processing Gate Alpha," announced the guard, whose voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "Female subjects prepare for medical examination and biological assessment. Compliance is mandatory." The words were clinical, bureaucratic, but they carried implications that made Lyra's skin crawl. Medical examination, biological assessment. The same terms that had been used during their initial processing aboard the Penitent's Burden, when tech-adept Vaughn had catalogued her reproductive capacity like livestock inventory. As the gate opened with a pneumatic hiss, Lyra found herself being herded toward a facility that hummed with the sound of industrial processes operating beyond human comprehension. The air grew thick with the smell of chemical processing and something else, something organic and wrong that made her throat close with instinctive revulsion. Around her, thousands of women moved with the shuffling gait of people who had already begun dying inside, their faces showing the hollow acceptance of those who understood they had moved beyond the reach of hope or mercy. In the distance, she could see the male prisoners being processed with brutal efficiency but recognizable humanity. Shaved heads, prison uniforms, assignment to labor details that would work them to death, but still acknowledge their basic human form. The facility loomed ahead, its walls glowing with bioluminescent markers that pulsed in rhythm with massive machinery. Through the transparent sections, she could see more of the mechanical constructs moving with purposeful intent, their forms suggesting functions that her mind refused to contemplate. As they approached the facility's entrance, Lyra realized that her escape attempt aboard the Penitent's Burden had been nothing more than a brief delay in a process that had been planned from the moment she was sentenced. The reproductive assessments, the fertility ratings, the careful cataloguing of genetic viability, all of it had been preparation for whatever waited beyond the glowing walls of the processing facility. From within came the sound of industrial machinery mixed with something else, a constant, rhythmic vocalization that might have been singing, if singing could be produced by creatures that had forgotten what it meant to be human. The facility's entrance dilated open like a mechanical iris, revealing the glowing interior where impossible constructs moved with mechanical precision. As the mass of women was herded forward, Lyra caught one last glimpse of the male prisoners through the chain-link fence, already being processed into standard labor assignments, their futures grim but comprehensible. Her future, she realized with growing horror, lay in a direction that the human mind wasn't meant to contemplate. The entrance sealed shut behind them with the finality of a tomb, and the processing began. Chapter 8 856.M40 Krieg Surface Operations Report. Tech Dominus Vex Kithera's tracked transport churned through the ash-laden mud of Krieg's surface, its atmospheric filters struggling against the planet's poisonous air. Through the reinforced viewport, he observed a sight that would have been unthinkable just 3 years earlier. Womb-servitors moving freely across the devastated landscape like mechanical pilgrims on an endless journey. The decision to release them from facility confinement had been born of necessity rather than design. Even with 43 massive production complexes, the physical space required to house 4.2 million womb-servitors had proven prohibitive. The bioelectrical interference from so many units operating in close proximity had begun causing system failures, while the mechanical vibrations from millions of walking legs had started compromising structural integrity in the larger facilities. "Surface deployment statistics, Magos," Vex Kithera requested through his VoxLink. "Currently tracking 4,187,392 active units across planetary surface," reported Magos biologist Harax from the central monitoring station deep beneath Hive Ferrograd. "Average dispersal pattern maintains optimal spacing for bioelectrical interference minimization. Delivery compliance rates remain at 99.7% efficiency." The transition had been surprisingly smooth. Womb-servitors possessed rudimentary navigation programming that guided them to the nearest delivery facility when their gestational cycles reached completion. Between deliveries, they wandered Krieg's surface following ancient road networks, game trails, and geological features that provided stable footing for their mechanical legs. Vex Kithera's transport crested a ridge overlooking the Ferox Valley, and the scope of their achievement became visible. Thousands of womb-servitors moved through the irradiated wasteland like a migration of impossible creatures. mechanical spiders carrying precious cargo through a landscape that could kill unprotected humans in minutes. Their biosacs glowed with bioluminescent markers, creating moving constellations across the darkened terrain. "Feeding Station Gamma 477 approaching," announced his servitor pilot. "Estimated arrival, 4 minutes." The feeding stations had been Vex Kithera's solution to the logistical nightmare of supporting millions of wandering biological factories. Positioned every 50 kilometers across Krieg's surface, these automated facilities provided nutritional supplements, mechanical maintenance, and data uplinks for the roaming womb-servitors. Each station could service 200 units simultaneously before requiring resupply. As they approached Gamma 477, Vex Kithera observed the familiar sight of womb-servitors converging on the facility. They moved with purpose, their mechanical legs carrying them across broken terrain with surprising grace. The programming that guided them was elegant in its simplicity: seek nutrition when biological reserves dropped below optimal levels, seek delivery facilities when gestational cycles neared completion, and wander between these waypoints, following paths that provided appropriate exercise for developing embryos. But it was what he observed next that had prompted this inspection tour. A column of Death Corps soldiers was approaching the feeding station from the opposite direction, their grey uniforms and distinctive helmets marking them as veterans of the Tyrannos campaign. They moved with the disciplined precision that characterized all Death Corps units, but their behavior as they neared the womb-servitors was distinctly unusual. The lead sergeant raised his hand, and the column halted at a respectful distance from the feeding station. Vex Kithera watched through magnification scopes as the Death Corps soldiers began performing what could only be described as maintenance rituals on the nearest womb-servitors. Using tools from their field kits, they carefully cleaned bio-residue from mechanical joints, applied lubricant to worn components, and performed minor adjustments to locomotion systems. Their movements were gentle, almost reverent, as they worked around the transparent biosacs containing developing embryos. Most remarkably, they showed no disgust or horror at the womb-servitors' hybrid nature. Where normal humans might recoil from the sight of women converted into biological machines, the Death Corps soldiers treated them with something approaching devotion. "Fascinating," Vex Kithera murmured, as he recorded the interaction through his augmetic sensors. A womb-servitor approached the soldiers, its Vox unit crackling with the recorded voice of a long-dead mother singing a Akkadian lullaby. The Death Corps sergeant removed his helmet and knelt beside the mechanical spider body, his weathered face showing an expression Vex Kithera had never seen on a Krieger before, something that might have been described as contentment. The soldier reached out with careful precision, adjusting a loose fitting on the servitor's leg assembly while humming along with the maternal vocalization. Around him, his squad performed similar maintenance tasks, their movements synchronized with the gentle rhythms of artificial motherhood emanating from the servitor's speakers. "Transport halt," Vex Kithera commanded. "I require direct observation of this phenomenon." His transport settled onto its landing struts, and Vex Kithera emerged into Krieg's hostile atmosphere. His augmetic systems immediately began filtering the toxic air while his biomonitors tracked radiation exposure levels. The Death Corps soldiers noticed his approach, but continued their maintenance work without interruption. "Sergeant," Vex Kithera addressed the squad leader, his Vox grill amplifying his voice above the wind. "Report your activities." The sergeant straightened to attention while maintaining his grip on a cleaning implement. "Routine maintenance, sir." Unit 23. Gamma 951-203 was showing signs of lubricant depletion in the secondary locomotion assembly. "We're correcting the deficiency." "This falls outside your operational parameters," Vex Kithera observed. "Death Corps units are not assigned maintenance duties for womb-servitor operations." The sergeant's expression showed the brief confusion of someone asked to explain something as natural as breathing. "Sir, the mothers require care. We provide care when encountered." Mothers. The term struck Vex Kithera with unexpected significance. The Death Corps didn't see the womb-servitors as industrial equipment or biological machines. To them, these hybrid creatures were maternal figures deserving of protection and respect. "Explain your reasoning, Sergeant." "Sir, the mothers carry our brothers. They sing to them, protect them, love them. It is proper that we show respect in return." The sergeant's voice carried the flat certainty that characterized all Death Corps communications, but Vex Kithera detected an underlying warmth that was distinctly non-regulation. Around them, other womb-servitors had begun converging on the feeding station. The Death Corps squad expanded their maintenance activities, working systematically through each unit as it arrived. They cleaned, lubricated, and performed minor repairs with the dedication of soldiers maintaining their weapons before battle. One of the servitors paused near Vex Kithera, its biosac glowing with the soft light of 43 developing embryos. The Vox unit crackled to life, playing a recording he recognized, the voice of a Vostroyan mother singing to her children during air raids. The melody was haunting in its artificial perfection, love distilled and broadcast on endless loop. The Death Corps soldiers worked around the servitor with careful reverence, their movements coordinated to avoid disturbing the precious cargo within the biosac. One trooper hummed along with the lullaby while cleaning bioresidue from the mechanical legs, his voice blending with the recorded maternal tones in an impromptu harmony. "Sir," the sergeant continued, "the mothers have always been with us. When we were small, in the growth tanks, we heard their voices. They spoke to us of duty, of honor, of love for the Emperor. It is right that we care for them as they cared for us." The theological implications were staggering. The Death Corps had developed an emotional connection to their artificial mothers that transcended the purely mechanical nature of their creation. They saw the womb-servitors not as industrial equipment, but as sacred figures worthy of veneration. More remarkably, this connection had developed organically without programming or indoctrination. The Death Corps' legendary efficiency and devotion to duty had been enhanced by their relationship with the wandering mothers, creating soldiers who fought not just for the Emperor, but for the mechanical wombs that had nurtured them. Vex Kithera observed the feeding station's operations as more womb-servitors arrived for nutritional replenishment. The automated systems dispensed biosupplements and performed diagnostic scans, while the Death Corps soldiers continued their volunteer maintenance work. The efficiency was remarkable. The servitors received both technological and personal care that exceeded anything the original facility-based system had provided. "This behavior is consistent across all Death Corps units?" Vex Kithera queried through his Vox link to the monitoring station. "Affirmative, Dominus," Harrix responded. "We've documented similar maintenance activities at 847 of 892 feeding stations currently under observation. Death Corps units consistently prioritize womb-servitor care when encountered during standard operations." The pattern was planet-wide. Wherever Death Corps soldiers encountered womb-servitors, they provided voluntary maintenance and protection. Guard units would alter patrol routes to check on nearby servitors. Engineering squads would perform unauthorized repairs during rest periods, and even frontline combat troops would carry extra lubricants and cleaning supplies specifically for servitor maintenance. "Sir," the sergeant approached Vex Kithera as his squad completed their work. "Request permission to escort the mothers to the next feeding station. Long-range auger scans indicate possible Orc presence in grid 77 Gamma." "Granted," Vex Kithera replied automatically, then paused as the implications registered. "Sergeant, does your unit frequently provide escort services for womb-servitor movements?" "When tactically feasible, sir. The mothers are precious cargo. We protect what is precious." As the Death Corps squad formed up around a group of 15 womb-servitors, Vex Kithera witnessed something unprecedented in Imperial military doctrine. Soldiers voluntarily assigning themselves to protect industrial equipment out of genuine affection rather than programmed duty. The procession moved out across Krieg's wasteland, with the Death Corps soldiers maintaining perfect formation around their mechanical charges. The womb-servitors' vox units created a symphony of maternal voices that mixed with the wind and the distant sound of artillery from the planet's eternal training exercises. Vex Kithera returned to his transport with new understanding of what they had achieved on Krieg. They had created more than an efficient production system for soldiers. They had created a symbiotic relationship between the Death Corps and their artificial mothers that strengthened both components. The womb-servitors received better care and protection through the voluntary maintenance provided by their children. The Death Corps soldiers gained emotional stability and enhanced motivation through their connection to the mechanical wombs that had nurtured them. The entire system had evolved beyond its original parameters into something approaching a genuine family structure. As his transport resumed course toward the next inspection site, Vex Kithera observed more interactions between Death Corps units and wandering womb-servitors. At every encounter, the pattern repeated: respectful approach, careful maintenance, protective escort when possible. The soldiers treated each servitor as a sacred relic worthy of their finest devotion. Perhaps, he reflected, they had achieved something greater than efficient soldier production. They had created love, artificial, programmed, mechanically delivered love that had somehow become real through the devotion of those who received it. On Krieg's surface, 4.2 million mechanical mothers wandered the wasteland, carrying the next generation of the galaxy's finest soldiers. And wherever they walked, their grown children followed, ensuring that the mothers who had whispered love to them in the darkness would never lack for care or protection. The Emperor protects, and sometimes his protection flowed through the maintenance rituals of grateful sons, caring for the mechanical wombs that had made them human. Thank you for listening to this audiobook. I'm Felix Weil, and it's been an honor to share this story with you. If you're ready for your next mission, Propaganda Press has a full arsenal of series waiting for you on this platform. Each one is locked and loaded with the kind of stories that keep you pressing forward, no matter what. For those who march to the beat of our soundtrack, all of our music is deployed across every major streaming platform: Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, you name it. Just search for Springfield Syndrome or the audiobook title to add it to your playlist. Your support keeps us in the fight, and we'd be grateful if you'd drop us a review wherever you grabbed this audiobook. Your feedback is our intel. It helps us improve our operations and helps other listeners find their next objective. Stay strong, stay sharp, and remember, the only easy day was yesterday. This is Felix Weil, signing off.